Was a beautiful single mom, working hard to make ends meet.
She was a lovable person, very friendly, outgoing. She's always been a hard worker, always.
So it only made sense that she'd meet the man of her dreams on the job.
Can I take you out sometime?
I'd love that.
As they grew to know each other, they became an item.
She thought she had this picturesque future ahead of her.
But that picturesque future crumbles in a matter of seconds.
They observed a young woman lying on the ground in a pool of blood. She'd been shot 5 times in her upper torso.
They observed a white male on the front porch.
The house was completely ransacked.
What initially appears to be a simple robbery gone wrong is anything but.
This is where I need you to be honest with me.
He was actually having an affair.
I definitely felt like there was jealousy there.
Hey, come listen to this.
Both of them snakes. They trying to put it all on me.
He told me he had killed someone.
It is diabolical. Absolute malice, absolute deprivation.
Yo, bro. Wanna hear a crazy story?
She was definitely more than my best friend.
She was more like my sister.
No, stop.
There's levels of me in like this. That's what Lord is working.
March 4th, 2015, Warrenton, Georgia. It's a quiet Wednesday morning in this charming town situated 100 miles east of Atlanta.
Warrenton, Georgia is between 5,000 and 6,000 population-wise. So it is a very, very small community.
Does it have crimes there? Yes. Are crimes very prevalent there? No.
Most people there are just good old calm country folks that go to work and come home and enjoy life.
At 11 a.m., Warrenton resident Donnie Brock is driving past his cousin's home when something catches him off guard.
As he approaches the home, he sees 2 men sprint across the street and get into a silver pickup truck before speeding off.
But that's not all.
He sees an individual lying motionless on the front porch of that residence.
Oh my God.
Donnie immediately calls his cousin, Sam Murphy, who owns the home.
Yo.
Man, I think there's a dead body on your front porch.
What? Yo, call police. I'll be over there as soon as I can.
Donnie hangs up with his cousin and makes the call to 911.
Yes, hi. We need some assistance on Mitchell Road.
When law enforcement arrived at the residence, they observed a white male on the front porch.
He's laying in a pool of blood and looks to have several gunshot wounds.
No pulse.
It's clear he has succumbed to his injuries. There is no use trying to save him.
Let's clear the home.
Not knowing what they'll find inside, police open the front door with guns drawn, keeping their eyes peeled for a possible suspect.
The house was completely ransacked. Items were completely turned upside down, drawers pulled out, stuff dumped on the floor.
Someone or some people were going through drawers and flipping over the beds and like they were searching for something.
And in the master bedroom, police realize they have a second victim on their hands.
They observed a young woman lying on the ground in a pool of blood. She'd been shot 5 times in her upper torso.
There were zip ties placed around her wrist.
They determined that she did not have a pulse.
We've got another victim in here, guys.
But who is she?
Where's Tanisha? Is she okay?
When the homeowner Sam Murphy arrives at the crime scene, investigators learn the female victim is his girlfriend, Tanisha Posley.
He's completely distraught. He says she was the love of his life.
28-year-old Tanisha Posley was the full package.
She was beautiful and stood out because of her looks, but she also had this incredibly warm personality.
She was a lovable person, very friendly, outgoing, loved to do hair, loved kids, loved spending time with her nieces.
She had a 9-year-old daughter that she had given birth to as a teenager, and that little girl was her whole world.
She had her daughter in January of 2006, and she loved her daughter. They were very close.
As a young single mom, Tanisha worked hard to provide for her daughter.
She made the best of it by working at the dollar store, where everyone loved her.
Have a good one.
She's always been a hard worker, always.
And it was at work in 2014 when Tanisha's beauty caught someone's eye.
You find everything okay?
Yeah, I did, thanks. How was your day?
Good. Thanks for asking.
His name was Sam Murphy.
There was a definite attraction that neither of them could deny.
Sam was also a single father.
He had a 2-year-old child.
And that stood out to her as someone who was responsible and loved their child.
This may be a bit forward of me, but can I take you out sometime?
I'd love that.
As they talked and grew to know each other, that relationship ultimately became romantic, and they became an item.
Tanisha saw Sam as someone who's established in life and could help provide for her and her daughter.
He treated her right and treated her with respect. That's all that mattered to me. And she was happy.
So when Sam asked her to move in with him at his home on the outskirts of Warrenton, Tanisha was ecstatic.
She thought she had this picturesque future ahead of her with Sam.
They were a really, really nice couple.
But now, instead of getting to enjoy their happily ever after, tragedy has struck, and Tanisha Posley has been found shot to death inside her and Sam's bedroom.
The question now is, how did she end up dead inside of their residence?
And Tanisha isn't the only victim at the crime scene.
There's a man on the front porch who's also succumbed to several gunshot wounds.
Police need to identify this second victim immediately.
Everything seemed to be going right for 28-year-old Tanisha Posley after she fell for a man named Sam Murphy.
She was happy. I mean, like in any other relationship, you have problems. But for the most part, she was happy.
But now, Georgia police are at the couple's rural Warren County home, where Tanisha has been discovered bound and shot.
Just before this, Sam's cousin spotted 2 mysterious individuals fleeing from the home in a silver pickup truck.
Sam seems absolutely distraught about what happened to Tanisha.
I can't believe what's happening,
We're
man.
gonna give you some time to calm down, and we'll talk to you later.
All right.
Police eventually take him back to the station to give a statement.
Meanwhile, homicide detectives work on identifying the second victim, a middle-aged man who has also suffered several gunshot wounds.
Found it. Oh, good.
There's an ID on him.
The male victim is 47-year-old Barry Johnson.
Barry Johnson was a construction worker and a beloved member of the neighboring community of Glasscock.
Barry was my brother. He was 18 months younger than me. Barry was a very kind person. He would do anything for you. Yeah.
He was gentle, goofy, kinda. He loved people. He's always there for people.
He loved kids, and he was an inspiration to my children. There's really no words to describe losing a sibling, your best friend.
Barry has been shot 8 times in the chest and shoulder.
Whoever shot Barry caught him by surprise because in his hand he was still holding his cigarettes.
Investigators believe Barry's killers fired the shots from inside the home.
On the inside of the residence, you have these 9mm casings on the floor and the storm door. You could see where the gunfire had went through the glass, striking Johnson out on the porch. So we got gunfire originating from inside the residence going out.
As law enforcement continued their investigation, they observed the entry point that would have been made during the robbery.
These individuals ran up, threw a brick through the glass door at the back of the residence, shattered it, and that was their entry into the residence.
Inside the home, investigators locate additional evidence that suggests a potential motive for the robbery.
They observed drug paraphernalia along with burner phones, and they determined that this could possibly have been a drug house.
To investigators, it's clear they're dealing with a robbery gone wrong.
But what isn't clear is, what was Barry Johnson doing here? What's his connection to Sam and Tanisha?
In their search for answers, detectives return to police headquarters and sit down with the homeowner, Sam Murphy.
Sam was very distraught and concerned for what has happened.
Everybody knows, man. That's why I can't see no other. Why they even do that, man?
That's what we're trying to figure out.
That was my lifeline. That girl was my lifeline. But tomorrow, everything. Financially, mentally, everything.
Even though Sam is upset, detectives have some tough questions they need to ask him.
All right, this is where I need you to be honest with me.
Yep, I would tell you.
Okay. Have you been selling dope?
I'm sorry.
All right. What do you sell? Marijuana?
Crack.
During our interview with Sam Murphy, he admitted to us that he was a drug dealer and that he often dealt drugs from his residence, and it was not uncommon for people to come by his residence to purchase crack cocaine.
So some people do know where you live then?
Yeah, yes, no.
I mean,
about 3, 4, something.
He did advise that he only sold to just a few close people to him.
Which is where Barry Johnson comes in.
What he told us was that's the reason Barry Johnson was at his residence to purchase crack cocaine.
Sam believes Barry and Tanisha were just collateral damage in the assailant's plot to rob him of his drugs.
Sam did advise law enforcement that he felt that he was the intended target.
They killed her, they were going down, so kill me if I've been there.
But the question is, why wasn't Sam at home when the break-in took place?
That's when Sam drops a bombshell that will turn the case on its head.
I want to see a female.
He had to reveal that he was actually having an affair with another woman.
Investigators in Warren County, Georgia, are speaking with Sam Murphy about the robbery gone wrong that took the life of his girlfriend, Tanisha Posley, and another man named Barry Johnson.
I started getting all these calls in Messenger, and people were saying, you know, is it true? Did Tanisha get killed? And I just remember just dropping my phone on the floor because I had no words. And I couldn't believe it because I just talked to her. It definitely left a void because she was definitely more than my best friend. She was more like my sister.
It's possible Sam Murphy was the intended target, and Tanisha and Barry were just collateral damage.
Sam admits that he'd been dealing drugs out of the home, and illegal drug activity tends to go hand in hand with violence.
They killed her, they were going down, so kill me if I've been there.
But why wasn't Sam at home when the burglary occurred?
At this point in the interrogation, Sam reveals a very important piece of information.
I want to see a female.
He had to reveal that he was actually having an affair with another woman.
What's the female's name?
Germany.
Franklin.
Germanique is someone Sam actually dated before he met Tanisha. In fact, she previously lived with him at the same home where the robbery happened.
He admitted that they had recently reconnected and started having an affair behind Tanisha's back.
Sometimes they would plan to have rendezvous with each other. Sometimes there would just be spur-of-the-moment encounters.
And on the day of the murder, Sam claims he had spent the entire afternoon with Germanique.
All right, where'd y'all meet at?
The Midwest.
He told us he drove to Rennes, Georgia, which is probably about 15 miles away, and had a rendezvous or sexual relationship with Germanique Franklin.
He was there when he got the call about Tanisha.
Detectives are eager to speak with Germanique to confirm Sam's story.
When they contact her, she's very forthcoming and willing to help.
Thanks for coming in to speak with us, Germanique.
Of course.
Now, let's start with your relationship with Sam Murphy. Were you in a sexual relationship with him?
Yes.
She essentially verified the information that Sam Murphy had provided us in that they had met at this particular hotel for sexual purposes.
So you can confirm he was with you at the hotel from 10 to 11 a.m. this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I still have the hotel receipts.
They're essentially able to confirm that Sam and Germanique were indeed at the hotel when the murders took place.
In their eyes, these two people are innocent.
For investigators, the key to solving this case is tracking down the two mystery men Donnie Brock saw fleeing from the crime scene that day. But police aren't getting any closer to locating them.
Every lead that they had, every follow-up that they did, led to a dead end.
The case wasn't going anywhere at that point.
Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The case had gone cold.
And after 6 months, nearly everyone has given up hope that justice will ever be served for Tanisha and Barry.
It was hard because the entire family and people that knew her, we were hurt.
It was like I was in a nightmare, still in disbelief the whole time because you don't have closure. You don't know who it is yet. You don't know why they done it. You don't know anything.
It was just a whole bunch of stuff. Nobody had any real answers.
But on September 30th, detectives finally catch a break in the case.
I received a call from a defense attorney telling me that an individual by the name of Reggie Hines, who was incarcerated at the McDuffie County Jail in Thompson, Georgia, had information on the double homicide that occurred on Mitchell Road.
We'll be right there. Thanks. We gotta go.
Of course, I immediately traveled to the jail and I met with Reggie Hines.
What you doing?
All right, you making it all right?
What?
Inmate Hines informed the officers that he was bunkmates with an individual by the name of Eric Snyder.
Y'all were in the same cell block, is that right? Same block?
Yes.
Reggie says a few days ago, Eric revealed some surprising information to him.
Yo, bro, you want to hear a crazy story?
According to Reggie, Eric told him that he was involved in the double homicide that took place on Mitchell Road.
Six months after Tanisha Posley and Barry Johnson were found shot to death, Georgia investigators have received a promising tip from a local inmate.
Reggie Hines told me that he had spoken with another inmate named Eric Snyder, who told him about the homicides in Warren County. Y'all were in the same cell block, is that right? Same block?
Yes.
And according to Reggie, Eric also named his co-conspirator.
That was me and my friend Donovan.
Eric had told him in confidence that he and Donovan Factz were the perpetrators of the double homicide.
Man, what happened?
So it was just supposed to be a robbery.
This guy already had drugs in the warranty. They're going to do this right way.
But they weren't expecting Tunisia to be there.
Oh my God.
Oh, no, come here.
They subdued Miss Posley and tied her up.
Then the two men proceeded to turn the place upside down, taking anything valuable they could find, including $8,000 in cash and drugs.
Something happened where Paul Fitzgerald's name, which is Donovan, that filled the girlfriend.
Yo, Donovan, did you check the bathroom yet, bro? Yo, what the hell, man?
And Donovan snapped. We called her real name and found her.
Donovan was scared that she may be able to identify him later on, since she knows his real name, so he didn't want to risk letting her live.
So he snapped and then he shot the girl.
No, stop, please. You don't have to do this.
Well, who shot the girl?
Donovan.
With one murder already on their hands, the thieves were ready to leave. But that's when they heard a knock at the front door.
Who thought the neighbor was at the door and she had the shots.
But in reality, it wasn't the neighbor. It was Barry Johnson who was there to visit Sam.
Sam! Barry! Everything okay in there?
He opened the door and been shot. Had the gun.
The investigators' suspicions are certainly piqued by what they're learning, but they'll need more than a jailhouse tip to make any sort of moves on Donovan and Eric.
Good luck to you, man, and I appreciate what you told me.
Neither of the men have a silver pickup truck registered to them, but that's the type of car witnesses saw fleeing from the crime scene. So there still seemed to be a big puzzle piece missing in this investigation.
Can Eric Snyder help fill in the missing piece?
After speaking with Reggie Hines, detectives sit down with Eric Snyder.
He's currently incarcerated for a separate robbery that took place a few days after the double homicide.
I interviewed Eric Snyder at the McDuffie County Jail and explained to him that we knew he was involved in a double homicide that occurred on Mitchell Road in Warren County, Georgia.
Right off the bat, Eric just denies.
Well, I didn't know nothing about the murder, gun deals and the murder. I ain't had nothing to do with it.
According to him, he's never been anywhere near the house on Mitchell Road and never said anything to Reggie Hines about participating in the homicides.
No, I didn't talk to anybody about it. I never talked to anybody about it.
So if anybody told us any information that you relayed to them about this homicide or any other homicide, saying that you were involved, that would be...
It's a complete lie.
A lie.
Eric even claims to have an alibi.
He said he was in court for a possessions charge at the time the double homicide took place.
I had court that day in Richmond County. And I think I had to be at 8:30. I don't believe it starts about 9. After I got out of court, we went straight to my house. I think we got there probably about 12:31.
However, Eric does admit that he saw his friend Donovan Factz later that same day, and Donovan wasn't alone.
Donovan had his girlfriend with him, and his girlfriend was Germanique Franklin.
In September of 2015, Georgia investigators are speaking with murder suspect Eric Snyder.
After receiving a tip from a local inmate, police believe Eric and his friend Donovan are involved in the double homicide of Tunisia Posley and Barry Johnson.
But Eric insists he's innocent.
It's a complete lie.
He quickly wanted to dispel the fact that he had anything to do with this murder.
He claimed he was at a court hearing for an unrelated drug possession charge at the time the homicide took place.
However, Eric admits that he and Donovan met up later that afternoon.
Donovan came over to Eric's place with his girlfriend, Germanique Franklin.
Investigators immediately recognize Germanique's name.
Tanisha Posley's boyfriend, Sam Murphy, was admittedly having an affair with Germanique Franklin, and they were together at a local hotel when the homicide took place.
But just like Sam, Germanique was in another relationship.
This entire time, she's been in a relationship with Donovan Factz, who is now a suspect in the murder of Sam's girlfriend. This seemed like more than just a coincidence.
Eric tells detectives that when Donovan and Germanique arrived at his home, something immediately seemed off.
They came to my house, I think it was about 2:30, maybe. He was sweating, looking kind of nervous, so I was like, what's going on?
Hey, baby, go inside the house right quick. I'm gonna talk to my homeboy about something.
All right.
Eric claims he never anticipated what Donovan said next.
He said he had went to rob a house in Warrington, and he told me he had killed someone.
Well, how many people were shot?
He said it was 2 people.
Okay, when Donovan told you what he had done, was she present?
No, ma'am, she wasn't present. We was outside talking, she was in the house.
So it was never all three of y'all discussing what happened.
Eric claims that Donovan had committed these murders by himself.
But investigators aren't going to just take his word for it.
They still suspect that he was involved in the crime and was there with Donovan that morning.
Back at the station, detectives take a closer look at Eric's alibi for the morning of March 4th.
He told us that he, in fact, was in court in Richmond County Misdemeanor Court that morning and could not have been a part of that homicide. Well, I spoke with the attorney, and she said it was a situation where the attorneys stand up for their clients and say whether they're going to plead guilty or not guilty. And a lot of times the defendants don't show up. And there's really no way of knowing if Eric had actually showed up for court or not.
Eric's alibi was not as ironclad as he claimed it to be.
Investigators still had a lot of work to do in unraveling what really happened here.
With Eric already behind bars on the unrelated crime, investigators move in on Donovan Factz next.
Donovan Factz was working at a construction site, and we had information that he was going to be at work that day. We came in, we saw him get out the vehicle, and we jumped out and we took him into custody.
Even back at police headquarters, Donovan refuses to cooperate with authorities.
He was very argumentative. He did not want any part of saying anything.
I have nothing to say to you.
He told me that he had an attorney, and of course I did not attempt to question him any further, and he was taken to jail.
But there's one more person investigators want to speak with: Germanique Franklin.
Now that they know she was in a relationship with one of the suspects in the double homicide, they bring her in for a second interview.
So we've learned some new information since the last time we spoke with you.
Okay.
Your boyfriend, Donovan Factz, has been implicated as one of the men involved in the double homicide.
What?
Did you know he was involved?
No, of course not.
She claimed she had no involvement or any knowledge of what had occurred on Mitchell Road. She completely denied being involved in the homicide.
Hitting a dead end with Germanique and Donovan, investigators decide to execute a search warrant on their shared home.
They were looking for any sort of concrete physical evidence that could tie the couple to the double homicide.
And eventually, they find just what they're looking for.
Police locate several 9mm shell casings inside the home.
These casings were from the same type of gun that killed Tanisha Posley and Barry Johnson.
And when detectives get their hands on the couple's phone records, they uncover more evidence against them.
Investigators obtained phone records showing that Donovan called Germanique 6 times during the break-in.
They were in constant communication while the robbery and subsequent homicide was going on.
Even without a confession, investigators are starting to paint a clear picture of what happened the morning of March 4th.
They believe the trio wanted to commit a robbery for some quick cash.
Knowing that her ex, Sam Murphy, dealt drugs and kept a lot of cash in the home, Germanique offered him up as the perfect target.
She lured him to the hotel for sex while Donovan and Eric broke into the home.
And Tanisha and Barry were collateral damage.
No, stop, please, you don't have to do it!
Investigators charge Eric Snyder, Donovan Factz, and Germanique Franklin with felony murder.
In Georgia, if you aid or abet in a crime, you can be charged with that crime. Now, it's clear that the female defendant was not in the house when the murders occurred, but what is very obvious is that she set these murders up. So that's why she was charged.
However, the circumstantial nature of this case will make for a challenging trial.
It can be really difficult when you don't have that smoking gun sometimes, because especially in this day and age, a jury really wants to be 130% sure. They want the DNA, and we didn't have that.
They had 3 individuals in custody, all telling conflicting stories against each other. So it was clearly a case that relied on one co-defendant telling on another.
But on March 6, 2017, as investigators prepare for trial, they get the break they've been looking for to solidify their case.
Hey, come listen to this.
They had the conversations made through the jailhouse of Donovan speaking to his sister.
Hello? What's up, sister? You asleep? I think they made a call.
In cell phone calls that Factz had made while he was in jail talking to his sister, he admitted being part of the double homicide.
It wasn't supposed to end like this. It wasn't, man. I swear to God it wasn't.
Two years after the double homicide of Tanisha Posley and Barry Johnson, Georgia investigators have finally charged 3 alleged co-conspirators with the crime: Eric Snyder, Donovan Factz, and his girlfriend, Germanique Franklin.
Investigators were a little concerned going into the trial because of how circumstantial their case was. None of the defendants had actually confessed to their involvement.
There really wasn't a smoking gun.
Until investigators receive a damning new piece of evidence on March 6th.
Come listen to this.
When making calls from the jail, Donovan Factz literally confessed to the crime to his sister.
So you did the shoe? No, but I was there. I had a big part of it. Why did you do it? I needed money. I needed everything. I mean, I ain't worth that though, boo. I know, man. I know. I f***ed up. It wasn't supposed to go like that, man. It wasn't supposed to end like this, man.
And he also talked about that they didn't intend to kill anyone and that it just happened.
However, most damning of all is what Donovan says about his co-defendants, Eric Snyder and Germanique Franklin.
Both of them snakes. Germanique trying to put it all on me, like I'm just a crazy boyfriend. She the one who told me about it, where his house was and everything.
And everybody said she was a mastermind behind it. She was the one who did it, like she had something to do with it.
Yeah.
He had named Germanique Franklin as setting it up, knowing the residence, knowing the fact that there would be money and drugs at the residence. He claimed that it was Germanique's idea for them to go over there.
We need to get this to the state attorney's office immediately.
You bet we do.
When the trio's murder trial gets underway in August 2017, prosecutors don't hold back.
In the opening arguments, prosecutors contend that the crime organized by Germanique Franklin and committed by her boyfriend, Donovan Factz, and his friend, Eric Snyder, was brutal beyond belief.
Germanique knew exactly what she was doing. I believe that she may have thought that there was a possibility that Tanisha could have been inside of the home.
For her, it wasn't just about the money, but there was a level of jealousy that the female defendant would have had to the new girlfriend.
I just know from being a woman that, you know, when you have a good relationship with someone, you'll have other women out there that are jealous of what you have. You will have females, you know, that just want your life. So I kind of feel like, you know, she knew Tanisha. She knew what type of person she was. So I definitely felt like there was jealousy there.
After Germanique lured Sam to the hotel for sex, Donovan and Eric made their move.
They throw the brick through the glass door and go in.
Before Tanisha had a chance to react, they tied her up with zip ties and left her helpless on the bedroom floor while they ransacked her home.
The male defendants attempt to steal money, drugs, anything that they could find.
But just as they were finishing up, they made a grave mistake.
Yo, Donovan, did you check the bathroom, bro? Yo, man, what the hell, man? What?
Donovan's real name had been used. And because of that, Donovan believed that he could not leave her alive.
No, stop, please, you don't have to do this.
She was shot 5 times.
However, before the killers could make their escape, another witness showed up, Barry Johnson.
Sam. He came to the house, perhaps to buy narcotics or to visit. He had no idea probably what was going on in the home, just really an innocent bystander.
Barry was shot 8 times.
After Barry was dead, the assailants collected a few more items from the home before fleeing in the silver pickup truck.
They fled in a vehicle that they borrowed from a friend and never looked back.
When the prosecution rests, they feel confident in their case. But the defense throws them a curveball no one sees coming.
They decide to zero in on Eric Snyder's alibi, that he was in court for drug possession charges on the morning of the homicide.
The defense subpoenas Eric's previous attorney to testify as to whether or not Eric was really in court when he said he was.
She couldn't testify that he had been in court the day of the murders, but she was able to testify that she did not have in her notes that he wasn't there.
To prosecutors, the alibi is flimsy either way.
Court is not all day, and I think that still gave him the opportunity to commit the murders.
However, the defense's strategy raises enough doubt in the minds of jurors.
In a strange twist, Eric was found not guilty because his alibi of being in court could not be broken.
However, the jury isn't as forgiving towards the other 2 defendants.
The jury was able to find Donovan and Germanique guilty.
They were both convicted of felony murder and sentenced to life in prison.
After waiting over 2 years to see justice served, the victims' loved ones are disappointed that only 2 individuals are charged for a crime they believe was carried out by 3 co-conspirators.
To doing something and then they're still out on the streets while he's not. He's gone. So I don't understand. I still to today don't understand how anybody could set up and do anything.
It's just something that you have to learn to cope with and deal with as time passes. But it never gets easier.
That's all you can do is take it day by day. But it does make it easier knowing that at least 2 of them are in prison. They will never, ever, ever get out.
This is just a case that was an absolute tragedy. It takes absolute malice, absolute deprivation of life, and just a cold heart to shoot 2 people over drugs, over money, and over jealousy.
When Tanisha Posley started dating Sam Murphy, she never could have expected that he'd start an affair that would end in her death.
The summer air over Fort Wayne, Indiana, carried the ordinary sounds of a quiet Midwestern neighborhood. Children rode bicycles through tree-lined streets. Lawns had just been cut. Families prepared for another weekend that promised nothing more dramatic than backyard barbecues and church on Sunday morning. No one could have imagined that within hours, one of the state's most haunting criminal investigations would begin, leaving an entire generation with a question that would remain unanswered for nearly 4 decades. Cold cases often begin with silence rather than violence. They begin with an ordinary day that suddenly refuses to end normally. On the morning of April 1st, 1988, 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley left her family's apartment to visit friends who lived only a short distance away. It was the kind of trip countless children made without fear. The neighborhood was familiar. The distance was short. Nothing suggested danger waited just beyond the next corner. She never returned home. At first, there was confusion rather than panic. Children sometimes lost track of time while playing. Parents checked with neighbors. Friends were asked whether they had seen her. Minutes stretched into an hour. An hour became several. As daylight faded, uncertainty transformed into dread. Calls were made to police. Officers arrived expecting what many missing child investigations initially become: a misunderstanding, a runaway, or a child hiding somewhere nearby. Instead, they encountered the beginning of one of Indiana's most disturbing criminal investigations. Patrol officers searched nearby streets, vacant lots, drainage ditches, parks, and wooded areas. Volunteers from the community quickly joined them. Flashlights pierced the darkness. Search teams called April's name repeatedly into the cold spring evening. Family members clung desperately to hope, believing that every passing minute increased the chance that she would answer. She never did. By sunrise, the search had expanded dramatically. Bloodhounds were deployed. Helicopters flew overhead. Officers knocked on doors throughout Fort Wayne, asking residents whether they had seen a little girl with brown hair wearing the clothes April had last been seen in. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with urgent bulletins. Newspapers prepared front-page stories describing a missing 8-year-old whose disappearance had already begun unsettling the city. Parents across Allen County reacted immediately. Children who had once played freely outdoors were called inside before sunset. School officials discussed additional safety precautions. Rumors spread rapidly, each more frightening than the last. Yet investigators possessed almost nothing concrete. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses who had seen April after she left to play. No obvious suspect emerged. No clear explanation fit the growing mystery. 3 days later, hope ended. On April 4th, 1988, a cyclist traveling through rural DeKalb County discovered the body of a young girl lying in a ditch along a country road approximately 20 miles from Fort Wayne. The isolation of the location was striking. Whoever had left the child there had chosen a place where discovery might take time. Investigators rushed to the scene. The victim was identified as April Tinsley. The confirmation devastated not only her family, but communities throughout northeastern Indiana that had followed every development with desperate optimism. The crime scene revealed evidence that immediately transformed the investigation into one of extraordinary complexity. Investigators documented every visible detail with painstaking care. Forensic specialists collected physical evidence according to the best scientific standards available in 1988. Detectives understood they were dealing with a homicide, unlike anything most had encountered during their careers. They knew every overlooked detail could become critical later. The autopsy established that April had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The brutality of the crime stunned even experienced investigators. There was no apparent connection between the victim and her attacker. No immediate motive beyond predatory violence became evident. Detectives began constructing timelines, interviewing neighbors, examining traffic patterns, and reviewing reports involving suspicious individuals seen anywhere near the neighborhood. Hundreds of interviews quickly became thousands. Every registered sex offender known to local authorities was scrutinized. Individuals with histories of violence were questioned repeatedly. Polygraph examinations were administered where legally appropriate. Leads flooded into the investigation from frightened citizens convinced they had seen suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar men. Most tips collapsed almost immediately under investigation. Others consumed valuable weeks before ending in disappointment. Still, detectives refused to slow their efforts. Public fear intensified when investigators disclosed another disturbing discovery. During the weeks following April's murder, handwritten notes began appearing in the Fort Wayne area. Some were reportedly left near locations where children might encounter them. The messages referenced April by name and contained deeply disturbing language suggesting knowledge of the crime. Whether the author intended to terrorize investigators, torment the victim's family, or boast privately about escaping justice, the psychological effect on the community was immediate and profound. Parents inspected playgrounds before allowing children to play. Schools warned students never to touch strange papers or approach unfamiliar adults. Every unexplained object suddenly seemed threatening. Every unfamiliar face became a possible suspect. Detectives examined the letters carefully. Handwriting experts analyzed every stroke. Linguistic specialists considered whether the wording revealed clues about the author's education, age, or personality. Fingerprints were sought wherever possible. The envelopes, paper, and ink were studied using forensic methods available at the time. Investigators understood the possibility that the letters had indeed been written by the killer, but proving that connection required evidence they simply did not possess. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded beyond Indiana. Federal authorities assisted local law enforcement because the possibility existed that a traveling offender had committed the crime before leaving the state. Information circulated through national law enforcement databases. The detectives compared April's murder with unsolved child abductions elsewhere in the United States, searching for similar patterns involving victim selection, disposal locations, or post-crime communications. Similarities appeared occasionally, but none proved definitive. Every promising comparison ultimately dissolved under closer examination. Behind every investigative meeting lay an uncomfortable truth. Modern forensic science had not yet reached the capabilities investigators desperately needed. DNA profiling was still developing. Techniques that would later revolutionize criminal investigations either did not exist or remained unavailable for routine casework. The detectives preserved biological evidence carefully, believing future technology might someday reveal answers hidden beyond the reach of 1988 science. That decision, seemingly routine at the time, would become one of the investigation's most significant acts of foresight. Yet no one could have predicted how long that future would take to arrive. Months passed. The initial flood of leads diminished. Detectives revisited witnesses repeatedly, hoping fading memories might suddenly reveal forgotten details. Composite sketches were circulated. Public appeals continued. Reward money increased. The case remained active, but momentum became increasingly difficult to sustain. Every investigator understood a painful reality familiar to homicide units everywhere. As time passes, memories weaken. Witnesses relocate. Physical evidence degrades. Opportunities disappear. Cold cases rarely become cold because detectives stop caring. They become cold because time itself becomes another obstacle. For April's family, each birthday became another reminder of what had been stolen. Every holiday carried the weight of absence. Community memorials honored the little girl whose smile had become known throughout Indiana through countless newspaper photographs and television broadcasts. Yet remembrance alone could not identify the man responsible. Investigators refused to abandon the file. Shelves filled with interview transcripts, laboratory reports, maps, photographs, evidence logs, and handwritten notes documenting years of relentless effort. Younger detectives entering the department learned the case from veterans who had spent countless hours chasing leads that ended nowhere. The investigation became more than a file number. It became an obligation passed from one generation of investigators to the next. Then, in 1990, nearly 2 years after April's murder, another development reignited fear throughout Fort Wayne. Additional anonymous messages connected to the case surfaced, again containing disturbing references interpreted by investigators as possible communications from the offender. The content suggested someone continued following public attention surrounding the murder. Detectives intensified efforts to trace the source, examining handwriting comparisons, delivery methods, and every forensic possibility available. Public anxiety surged once again. Parents who had slowly begun relaxing restrictions tightened them immediately. The possibility that the killer remained nearby, watching, waiting, perhaps even enjoying the community's fear, became almost impossible to ignore. Yet, despite renewed investigative activity, no arrest followed. The letters became another haunting element within an already disturbing mystery, simultaneously providing hope that the offender had exposed himself and frustration because those clues still refused to reveal his identity. Years gradually accumulated. Advances in forensic DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations across America. Cases once considered impossible suddenly produced suspects through microscopic biological evidence. Detectives responsible for April's file monitored every scientific breakthrough closely. Evidence preserved since 1988 was re-examined repeatedly as laboratory methods improved. Each advancement generated cautious optimism. Each new round of testing offered another possibility that science might finally succeed where conventional investigation had failed. Still, the answers remained frustratingly beyond reach. The murder of April Tinsley had evolved into something larger than a single criminal investigation. It had become a symbol of persistence, loss, and the relentless pursuit of justice despite decades of disappointment. Detectives understood that somewhere, a man had lived freely while generations of investigators continued searching for the mistake that would finally expose him. None of them could yet know that the breakthrough they needed would not come from a confession, an eyewitness, or a forgotten piece of paperwork, but from a revolution in forensic genetics that would forever change the way cold cases were investigated across the world. The investigation entered its second year carrying the weight of thousands of unanswered questions. Every detective assigned to the April Tinsley case understood that the first 48 hours of any homicide often determine its future. Yet this case had defied every expectation from the beginning. The obvious suspect had never appeared. No reliable eyewitness could identify the person responsible. The killer had vanished almost as completely as if he had never existed. What remained was an expanding archive of evidence, interview transcripts, crime scene photographs, forensic reports, handwritten notes, and thousands of individual leads that demanded attention. Every page represented another possibility. Every possibility carried the hope that somewhere inside the growing mountain of paperwork lay one overlooked detail capable of changing everything. Investigators reconstructed April's final known movements minute by minute. Officers returned repeatedly to the neighborhood where she had lived, measuring walking distances, documenting sightlines, studying traffic patterns, and identifying every residence from which someone might have witnessed part of her journey. Children who had been playing nearby were interviewed with extraordinary care. Detectives knew that young witnesses often remembered details adults ignored: a vehicle parked where it did not belong, a stranger asking unusual questions, a face seen only briefly but remembered because it seemed out of place. Specialists trained in interviewing children attempted to recover every possible fragment of memory without introducing suggestion. Most recollections were sincere but incomplete. Some contradicted one another. Others could never be independently verified. None identified the killer. Attention quickly shifted toward vehicles. Detectives believed the abduction had likely occurred rapidly. There was little indication of a prolonged struggle in public view. That suggested an offender who either gained the child's trust long enough to bring her close to a vehicle or forced her inside before anyone nearby realized what had happened. Every report involving suspicious vans, pickup trucks, sedans, or unfamiliar automobiles became part of the investigation. Hundreds of vehicle registrations were examined. Owners were interviewed. Mechanics were asked whether unusual repairs had been requested shortly after the murder. Salvage yards were contacted. Used car dealers were questioned. Each promising lead dissolved under scrutiny. The investigation widened beyond Allen County. Detectives contacted agencies throughout Indiana and neighboring states, comparing unsolved crimes involving children. They searched for common methods, similar victim profiles, and offenders who traveled regularly between communities. At the time, law enforcement cooperation depended heavily upon telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships between investigators. National computerized databases existed but lacked the speed and interconnected capabilities that investigators take for granted today. Detectives often spent days waiting for files to arrive from another jurisdiction, only to discover that the comparison produced no meaningful connection. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued examining every piece of physical evidence collected during the original investigation. Hair fibers were compared under microscopes. Soil samples from the rural recovery site were analyzed. Trace evidence recovered from clothing underwent repeated examination. Fingerprint specialists reviewed impressions collected from relevant locations. Laboratory personnel followed the highest standards available during the late 1980s, but scientific limitations remained unavoidable. Some evidence simply could not answer the questions investigators desperately wanted answered. Biological material existed, But forensic DNA profiling remained in its early stages and was far from the comprehensive investigative tool it would later become. Public attention refused to fade. Newspapers published anniversary stories reminding readers that a killer remained unidentified. Local television stations revisited the investigation, interviewing detectives and community leaders who urged anyone with information to come forward. Reward offers increased. Anonymous tip lines remained active. Every new broadcast generated another wave of telephone calls. Some callers believed they recognized composite descriptions. Others accused neighbors, former co-workers, or distant relatives based on little more than instinct or rumor. Detectives documented every allegation carefully. Even improbable claims received attention because experience had taught investigators that extraordinary cases sometimes turned on information initially dismissed as insignificant. The emotional burden upon April's family never disappeared. Every interview given to reporters required reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Every public appeal forced them to relive the unimaginable loss of an 8-year-old daughter whose life had ended before it had truly begun. Community members organized memorial events intended both to honor April and to maintain public awareness of the investigation. The message remained constant. Someone knew something. Someone had seen something. Somewhere, a detail existed that had not yet reached investigators. Then the anonymous communications transformed from disturbing curiosities into one of the investigation's defining mysteries. In 1990, a young girl riding her bicycle discovered a handwritten note attached to a sign near her home. The message was deeply unsettling. It claimed responsibility for April's murder and contained threatening language directed toward children. Investigators immediately secured the note as evidence. Handwriting experts compared it with previous anonymous writings connected to the case. Linguists examined vocabulary, spelling patterns, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure, hoping the author's habits might reveal educational background, occupation, age, or regional influences. Every letter, every pen stroke, every indentation became important. The note frightened parents across northeastern Indiana. Schools issued additional safety reminders. Children were instructed never to approach strangers, never to accept rides, and immediately to report suspicious behavior. Fear returned with remarkable intensity because the message suggested that whoever had murdered April remained alive, free, and willing to communicate. Whether the author genuinely was the killer or merely someone exploiting a notorious crime, investigators had to assume the communication represented a legitimate threat until proven otherwise. Detectives analyzed the paper itself. Manufacturers were contacted. Ink composition was examined where technology permitted. Fingerprints were sought. The physical characteristics of the note offered only limited assistance. It had been handled carefully enough that identifying evidence remained elusive. Once again, investigators found themselves confronting a suspect who seemed consistently able to avoid leaving behind the type of evidence that could produce an arrest. Behavioral specialists considered another possibility. Criminal profilers examined the communications not as forensic evidence, but as psychological evidence. The individual responsible appeared interested in maintaining a connection to the crime long after the murder itself. That suggested someone deriving satisfaction from continued public attention, community fear, or the frustration experienced by investigators. Such behavior had been observed in certain offenders who viewed anonymous communications as a means of extending control over victims, families, and law enforcement. Yet profiling could describe possibilities. It could not identify a name. Investigators revisited convicted sex offenders throughout the region. Some individuals underwent additional interviews years after the original homicide simply because new behavioral theories suggested different questions should be asked. Employment histories were reviewed. Residential records were examined. Travel patterns received renewed scrutiny. Detectives compared handwriting samples obtained legally from various individuals against the anonymous notes. Every comparison ended the same way. Insufficient evidence. No definitive match. Another led closed. The case slowly accumulated an almost mythic status inside Indiana law enforcement. Newly assigned detectives inherited boxes of reports from predecessors who had retired, transferred, or passed away. Veteran investigators warned younger officers never to underestimate the file simply because years had passed. Every cold case contained the possibility that one overlooked detail remained hidden within thousands of pages. Every interview transcript deserved another reading. Every photograph deserved another look. Experience repeatedly demonstrated that successful cold case investigations often resulted not from discovering entirely new evidence, but from recognizing the significance of evidence that had existed all along. Technology evolved steadily during the early 1990s. Computers became more common inside police departments. Databases improved. Information sharing gradually accelerated. Detectives responsible for April's case ensured that evidence remained preserved under conditions allowing future examination as scientific capabilities advanced. This decision reflected remarkable foresight. No one could predict precisely how forensic science would develop, but investigators increasingly believed that evidence impossible to interpret today might become decisive tomorrow. DNA profiling represented perhaps the greatest source of cautious optimism. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic DNA had already demonstrated extraordinary potential in selected criminal investigations. However, testing required relatively large biological samples, laboratory procedures remained time-consuming, and national DNA databases capable of broad comparisons were only beginning to emerge. Detectives monitored these developments closely. Whenever laboratory improvements occurred, evidence from April's case was reconsidered to determine whether additional testing had become feasible. The passage of time created unexpected complications. Witnesses relocated across the country. Some died before investigators could ask follow-up questions generated by later discoveries. Memories inevitably faded. Individuals who had once remembered precise dates or conversations gradually became uncertain. Vehicles had been sold or destroyed. Businesses closed. Records disappeared under routine document retention policies. Every year that passed subtly altered the investigative landscape, making reconstruction of events increasingly difficult. Despite those obstacles, investigators refused to classify the murder as forgotten. Regular case reviews became standard practice. Teams assembled to challenge previous assumptions, questioning whether earlier conclusions had unintentionally narrowed the investigation too quickly. Fresh detectives approached the evidence without emotional attachment to theories developed years earlier. Sometimes they identified overlooked inconsistencies. Occasionally, they reopened leads previously dismissed. Although these reviews failed to identify the killer, they ensured the investigation remained active rather than dormant. Outside law enforcement, April Tinsley's name became synonymous with child safety campaigns throughout Indiana. Parents who remembered the spring of 1988 described it as the moment childhood changed. Before the murder, many neighborhoods embraced a level of trust now difficult to imagine. Children walked or rode bicycles independently through familiar streets. After April's death, that sense of security fractured. Parents established stricter rules. Schools expanded educational programs concerning stranger awareness. Communities recognized that unimaginable violence could arrive without warning, even in places long considered safe. For investigators, however, emotional consequences never replaced professional determination. Every anniversary served as another reminder that somewhere the offender continued living an ordinary life while carrying knowledge known only to himself. Detectives often wondered whether he followed media coverage, clipped newspaper articles, or quietly celebrated each passing year without arrest. Did he fear capture whenever another forensic breakthrough appeared in the news? Did he believe he had escaped forever? Those questions lingered unanswered, but one fact remained certain. The evidence preserved since 1988 still existed, waiting for scientific advances powerful enough to reveal what previous generations of investigators had been unable to see. At the time, no one inside the investigation could know that the revolution capable of breaking the case would not come from a dramatic confession or an unexpected eyewitness. It would emerge gradually through decades of scientific innovation, patient evidence preservation, and a revolutionary approach to forensic genealogy that had yet to be imagined, quietly transforming the future while April Tinsley's case continued waiting in silence. Years passed, but inside the Fort Wayne Police Department, the April Tinsley case never truly became a relic. It remained alive in filing cabinets, evidence lockers, and the minds of detectives who refused to accept that a child could be abducted, sexually assaulted, murdered, and left without accountability. Every anniversary of April's death brought renewed media attention. Her photograph reappeared on television screens and newspaper front pages. The same questions echoed year after year. Who had taken her? Why had no one recognized him? And how could someone commit such a brutal crime, then seemingly disappear without leaving a trail? By the early 1990s, investigators had accumulated thousands of pages of documentation. Interview summaries filled binders. Maps marked locations where witnesses reported seeing suspicious people or unfamiliar vehicles. Photographs from the crime scene had been examined countless times. Detectives often joked grimly that they could identify every tree, ditch, and gravel road surrounding the recovery site from memory alone. Yet familiarity with the evidence did not produce answers. The investigation evolved into what experienced detectives sometimes call a living file. Unlike closed investigations stored permanently in archives, this case remained active despite the absence of arrests. Every new lead, no matter how unlikely, required evaluation. Anonymous telephone calls arrived at all hours. Some callers genuinely wanted to help. Others repeated neighborhood rumors that had circulated for years. Occasionally, someone claimed to possess first-hand knowledge, only for investigators to discover the information had originated from newspaper articles published years earlier. Detectives understood another unfortunate reality. High-profile, unsolved murders often attract individuals who seek attention by inserting themselves into investigations. False confessions, fabricated witness statements, and invented theories consume valuable investigative resources. Each claim had to be examined carefully because dismissing a truthful statement as another hoax carried enormous risk. Yet pursuing every deception also diverted time away from productive investigative work. Balancing skepticism with openness became part of the daily challenge. The anonymous letters connected to April's murder remained among the investigation's most disturbing elements. Their existence suggested either extraordinary cruelty by an unrelated individual or continued psychological involvement by the killer himself. Behavioral experts revisited the writings repeatedly, searching for characteristics that earlier examinations might have overlooked. They considered sentence structure, spelling habits, word choices, punctuation patterns, and emotional tone. Some analysts believed the author displayed confidence bordering on arrogance. Others believed the messages reflected someone deeply invested in maintaining emotional control over both investigators and the community. The possibility that the killer continued living within northeastern Indiana received increasing attention. Detectives reasoned that someone willing to leave threatening communications might also feel comfortable remaining geographically close to the original crime. If true, residents could have encountered him regularly without realizing they were speaking to the individual responsible for one of the region's most notorious child murders. That possibility unsettled investigators as much as it frightened the public. Background investigations expanded dramatically. Detectives examined employment records, military histories, criminal convictions, traffic violations, property ownership, and residential changes involving hundreds of individuals considered even remotely relevant. Men whose names had surfaced during earlier interviews were revisited years later. Sometimes investigators simply wanted updated handwriting samples. Sometimes they wished to compare old statements with newer information. Minor inconsistencies occasionally emerged, but none developed into prosecutable evidence. Forensic science, meanwhile, advanced at a pace few investigators could have predicted. Throughout the 1990s, DNA technology became increasingly sophisticated. Laboratories required smaller biological samples. Testing methods improved in both accuracy and sensitivity. Cases that previously yielded inconclusive laboratory results suddenly produced usable genetic profiles. Across the United States, detectives watched long unsolved murders begin falling one after another as DNA evidence identified offenders who had escaped justice for decades. Naturally, attention returned to April Tinsley's case. Evidence preserved since 1988 underwent renewed laboratory evaluation whenever significant improvements became available. Scientists handled each item with extraordinary caution. Biological evidence, once consumed during testing, could never be replaced. Every decision required balancing the possibility of obtaining valuable information against the risk of exhausting material that future technologies might analyze even more effectively. Those responsible for preserving the evidence years earlier had made an extraordinarily important decision. Instead of assuming available science represented the final word, they had carefully maintained biological samples for future examination. That foresight reflected an understanding shared by experienced homicide investigators. Scientific limitations rarely remain permanent. Technology changes. Methods improve. Evidence that appears silent today may someday speak clearly. Despite repeated testing, immediate success remained elusive. Investigators obtained genetic information believed to belong to the offender, but possessing a DNA profile and identifying the individual behind it were entirely different challenges during the 1990s. The Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, gradually expanded across the United States, allowing law enforcement agencies to compare crime scene DNA with profiles collected from convicted offenders and certain arrestees according to applicable laws. The April Tinsley profile entered available databases. Detectives waited. No match appeared. Weeks became months. Months became years. Each time databases expanded with additional offender profiles, investigators submitted fresh comparison requests. Again, nothing. The absence of a match created two troubling possibilities. Either the killer had never been required to submit DNA under existing laws, or his DNA simply had not yet entered any searchable database. Both scenarios meant the investigation remained dependent upon traditional detective work despite possessing the offender's genetic fingerprint. For many investigators, this became one of the case's greatest frustrations. They knew the killer had left biological evidence. They knew science had successfully isolated a usable DNA profile. They knew that profile belonged to the murderer. Yet they had no name. It was like possessing a fingerprint without any fingerprints to compare against. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, cold case investigations increasingly embraced multidisciplinary review teams. Detectives, prosecutors, forensic scientists, crime analysts, and behavioral specialists gathered around conference tables to reconsider evidence collectively rather than through isolated specialties. April's case received repeated comprehensive reviews. Participants challenged long-held assumptions. Could investigators have misinterpreted witness statements? Had attention focused too heavily on one geographic area? Had someone dismissed years earlier deserved closer scrutiny? Every theory underwent careful examination. None produced the breakthrough everyone sought. Outside the investigation, the world changed dramatically. Cell phones became common. Digital records replaced paper files. Internet communication transformed how information spread. Surveillance cameras appeared in businesses, intersections, and neighborhoods. Investigators often reflected upon how differently the case might have unfolded had such technologies existed in 1988. Modern digital evidence routinely establishes timelines through mobile phone records, electronic payments, security footage, GPS data, and internet activity. None of those investigative tools existed during April's disappearance. The killer had committed his crime during an era when disappearing required far fewer obstacles. Even so, detectives refused to surrender. New generations of investigators inherited responsibility for the file. Many had been children themselves when April disappeared. Some entered law enforcement inspired partly by cases exactly like this one. They approached the investigation with fresh perspectives while respecting decades of meticulous work completed before them. One recurring question never disappeared. Why April? Detectives examined whether the victim had been specifically targeted or selected opportunistically. They reconstructed her daily routines, school schedules, friendships, neighborhood activities, and family life. Nothing suggested she possessed any connection to a future suspect. The evidence instead supported the deeply disturbing possibility that she encountered a sexual predator entirely by chance. That realization carried enormous implications. If the murder resulted from random victim selection, then identifying the offender through conventional investigative methods became vastly more difficult. There might be no personal relationship, no shared workplace, no family connection, no financial motive, and no obvious circle of acquaintances capable of pointing detectives toward the killer. Random predatory crimes often leave investigators almost entirely dependent upon physical evidence. Fortunately, physical evidence still existed. By the early 2000s, forensic laboratories revisited preserved biological material once again using increasingly advanced DNA techniques. Scientists refined genetic profiles, confirmed earlier findings, and ensured evidence integrity remained uncompromised. Every successful laboratory improvement reinforced one conclusion: the biological evidence remained suitable for future analysis. That fact alone kept hope alive. Meanwhile, entirely new investigative concepts began emerging elsewhere in criminal justice. Researchers explored familial DNA searching. Scientists discussed broader genetic databases. Genealogists demonstrated remarkable abilities to reconstruct extended family trees using historical records, birth certificates, census documents, marriage licenses, and public archives. Initially, few homicide detectives imagined these developments would someday intersect. Genealogy belonged to historians and family researchers. The homicide investigations belonged to police. The disciplines appeared unrelated. No one yet recognized they were slowly moving toward one another. Within forensic science conferences, conversations increasingly focused upon possibilities once considered unrealistic. Could distant relatives assist criminal investigations? Could unidentified DNA eventually reveal family connections rather than exact individual matches? Could historical records combine with genetics to identify someone who had never submitted DNA directly? These questions remained largely theoretical. There was no established investigative blueprint. No famous success story existed. Most detectives continued relying upon conventional database comparisons while preserving evidence for whatever future science might offer. Inside evidence storage facilities, April Tinsley's case waited patiently. The sealed envelopes, the laboratory reports, the biological samples, the photographs, the handwritten letters. Everything remained preserved. Nothing had been discarded. That careful preservation reflected decades of discipline exercised by investigators who refused to believe the file would remain unsolved forever. They could not know exactly how justice would eventually arrive, but they believed science had not spoken its final word. They were right. Somewhere beyond the walls of police departments and forensic laboratories, a quiet revolution was beginning inside the field of genetic genealogy. It was not designed to solve murders. It was intended to help ordinary people discover forgotten ancestors and distant cousins. Yet within a few short years, that same technology would fundamentally reshape cold case investigations across America. The evidence waiting silently since the spring of 1988 would finally meet the scientific breakthrough capable of revealing what nearly 4 decades of traditional investigation had not. The investigation entered its third decade with an unusual combination of frustration and cautious optimism. Time had stolen witnesses, blurred memories, and erased countless opportunities that might have existed in the days immediately following April Tinsley's murder. Yet time had also delivered something investigators in 1988 could never have imagined. Forensic science was advancing faster than at any point in modern criminal history. Techniques once confined to research laboratories had become routine investigative tools. Cases that had gathered dust for decades were suddenly producing arrests. Across the United States, detectives responsible for long-forgotten homicides watched as DNA transformed impossible investigations into solvable ones. Still, the April Tinsley case refused to yield. The offender's DNA profile remained preserved, confirmed, and unquestionably linked to the crime. Detectives knew they possessed the genetic signature of the man responsible. The problem remained exactly the same as it had been for years. There was no matching identity. Each expansion of CODIS generated renewed anticipation. Laboratories uploaded thousands of additional offender profiles. Investigators requested new comparisons, hoping the killer had recently been convicted of another qualifying offense or that a previously unavailable profile had entered the system. Every comparison ended with the same result: no match. The absence of a database hit slowly changed investigators' thinking. If the offender had avoided detection for so many years, perhaps he had never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA collection. Perhaps he had committed no other known violent offense. Or perhaps he had managed to live an outwardly ordinary life while carrying the secret of one of Indiana's most notorious child murders. That possibility disturbed detectives more than almost anything else. They had interviewed countless offenders over the years. Many violent criminals left behind patterns: multiple arrests, escalating behavior, repeated contact with law enforcement. But some offenders did not fit familiar expectations. Some blended into communities, maintained employment, raised families, attended church, greeted neighbors politely, and quietly concealed crimes that no one around them could imagine. Could April's killer be one of those individuals? The question lingered during every case review. Cold case detectives approached the investigation with fresh eyes. They re-examined assumptions that earlier investigators had accepted simply because no better explanations existed at the time. Every witness interview received another reading. Every timeline was reconstructed. Geographic profiles were updated using modern analytical techniques. Crime analysts mapped locations connected to the investigation, searching for spatial relationships that earlier generations of detectives lacked the technology to identify. Computers accomplished in minutes what previously required weeks of manual comparison. Yet even sophisticated software produced no obvious suspect. The anonymous letters also returned to the center of attention. Advances in forensic document examination allowed specialists to revisit evidence that had already undergone numerous analyses. Imaging technology revealed microscopic characteristics invisible to earlier investigators. High-resolution digital enhancement examined pen pressure, writing rhythm, and subtle habits unique to individual authors. Behavioral experts reconsidered the content itself. The letters appeared deeply personal. The writer seemed invested not merely in frightening the public, but in maintaining psychological ownership of the crime. Investigators debated whether the communications reflected narcissism, compulsion, or deliberate manipulation. Some believed the offender derived satisfaction from watching law enforcement struggle. Others believed the letters represented an irresistible urge to revisit the murder emotionally. Whatever the motivation, one conclusion remained consistent. The communications suggested confidence. Confidence often develops when someone believes they cannot be identified. That confidence, detectives hoped, might eventually become the killer's greatest mistake. Meanwhile, entirely new forms of DNA analysis emerged. Scientists refined methods capable of recovering usable genetic information from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Laboratories improved contamination controls. Statistical models became more precise. Genetic profiles grew more detailed than investigators in 1988 could ever have imagined. Every advancement prompted another review of April's evidence. Laboratory personnel handled the preserved biological material with extraordinary caution. Evidence from famous cold cases is irreplaceable. One careless mistake could destroy opportunities decades in the making. And testing proceeded methodically. Each result reinforced previous findings. The DNA profile remained strong, reliable, suitable for future comparison. Yet the central obstacle persisted. Science knew the killer genetically. It simply did not know his name. Around the same time, an entirely separate world was quietly undergoing its own revolution. Millions of ordinary people had begun exploring family history. Genealogy websites gained enormous popularity. Individuals submitted saliva samples hoping to discover distant relatives, trace ancestral origins, or construct family trees extending back centuries. What began primarily as a recreational interest rapidly generated enormous genetic databases containing information voluntarily contributed by private citizens. Initially, law enforcement paid relatively little attention. The databases existed for ancestry research, not criminal investigations. Privacy rules varied. Technology remained experimental. Few investigators imagined they would someday use genealogy to identify homicide suspects. Yet several visionary forensic scientists began asking an important question. If two strangers could discover they were distant cousins through shared DNA, could investigators potentially identify an unknown criminal using the same biological relationships? The concept sounded almost unbelievable. Instead of searching for the suspect directly, investigators might search for relatives. A second cousin. A third cousin. Perhaps someone sharing only a small percentage of DNA. From there, traditional genealogical research could potentially reconstruct enormous family trees, gradually narrowing possibilities until only one individual fit all available evidence. The theory demanded extraordinary patience. It also required impeccable science. One mistake could wrongly implicate innocent families. For several years, the idea remained largely experimental. Then, in unrelated investigations elsewhere in the United States, remarkable breakthroughs began attracting national attention. Cases that had resisted solution for decades suddenly collapsed under the combined power of forensic genetics and traditional detective work. Experienced investigators noticed immediately. Cold case conferences changed dramatically. Sessions once dominated by discussions of fingerprints, witness interviews, and crime scene reconstruction increasingly focused upon forensic genealogy. Detectives responsible for famous unsolved murders listened carefully. Could this approach work for their investigations? Would preserved DNA remain suitable? What legal procedures govern such searches? How should investigators verify conclusions independently? The April Tinsley case naturally entered those conversations. Its strengths were obvious. A high-quality offender DNA profile already existed. Evidence integrity had been carefully maintained. Traditional investigative avenues had largely been exhausted. If any investigation seemed appropriate for emerging forensic genealogy, this one certainly qualified. Still, detectives moved cautiously. Scientific breakthroughs often generate unrealistic expectations. Investigators understood the importance of confirming every result independently before making accusations. Genealogy could point investigators toward possibilities. It could not replace conventional police work. every potential suspect would still require corroborating evidence. Meanwhile, April's family continued living through another cycle of anniversaries. Nearly every year brought fresh media interviews. Journalists asked familiar questions. Did they still believe justice would come? How had decades without answers affected them? What message would they give investigators? The family's determination remained unwavering. They refused to allow April's memory to disappear. Community support never vanished either. Residents who had been children themselves during the original investigation now had children of their own. Many remembered parents warning them not to walk alone after April disappeared. The murder had permanently altered the community's sense of safety. It remained more than an unsolved homicide. It had become part of the region's collective memory. Inside the Fort Wayne Police Department, detectives responsible for cold cases increasingly believed they stood at the edge of something historic. Not because they possessed a suspect. Not because a witness had finally come forward. But because science itself appeared ready to answer questions that previous generations had been unable even to ask. They reviewed every preserved item again. Evidence storage conditions were verified. Chain of custody records were confirmed. Laboratory documentation received meticulous examination. If forensic genealogy became available for this investigation, detectives wanted absolute confidence that every scientific step could withstand courtroom scrutiny. The preparation required patience. No shortcuts existed. Every decision might someday face cross-examination before a jury. Investigators understood that identifying a suspect after 30 years represented only part of the challenge. Convicting him would require proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt using evidence collected decades earlier. That demanded extraordinary precision. As discussions surrounding forensic genealogy accelerated nationally, detectives quietly prepared the April Tinsley investigation for technologies that scarcely existed when the crime occurred. No public announcements suggested dramatic progress. No headlines declared an imminent breakthrough. To outside observers, the case still appeared frozen in time. But beneath that appearance, momentum was building. Scientific disciplines once completely unrelated had begun converging. Forensic biology, genetic genealogy, digital record analysis, traditional detective work, historical documentation. Each field contributed one piece of a puzzle nearly 40 years old. The killer remained unaware. If he followed news reports, he likely saw another anniversary story. Another reminder that police still sought answers. Another appeal for witnesses. Nothing suggesting investigators were approaching the case from an entirely new direction. For decades, he had escaped because no one knew his identity. Soon, investigators would begin searching not for him directly, but for the biological echoes he unknowingly shared with generations of relatives who had never heard his name connected to April Tinsley's murder. That subtle shift in strategy would become one of the most significant turning points in modern cold case history, proving that even the smallest fragments of inherited DNA could eventually illuminate secrets buried for nearly 4 decades. The strategy that would eventually reshape the April Tinsley investigation did not begin with a dramatic discovery inside an evidence locker or a witness walking unexpectedly into a police station. It began hundreds of miles away, inside laboratories and genealogy research centers where scientists and investigators were quietly proving that DNA could reveal far more than identity alone. It could reveal family. It could expose relationships separated by generations. It could connect people who had never met. Most importantly for law enforcement, it could point detectives toward individuals whose DNA had never been collected by police at all. For decades, investigators had relied on a straightforward principle: recover DNA from a crime scene, compare it against known offenders in law enforcement databases. If the individual had previously provided a sample under applicable laws, a match might appear. If not, the investigation reached another dead end. Genetic genealogy challenged that limitation completely. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators could begin asking, "Who in this person's extended family has voluntarily submitted DNA for ancestry research?" The distinction was revolutionary. A direct match was no longer the only path toward identification. A distant cousin could become the first thread. That thread, patiently followed through generations of historical records, might eventually lead to the individual investigators had sought for decades. By the mid-2010s, several pioneering cases had demonstrated that this approach could work under carefully controlled circumstances, the results captured national attention within law enforcement. Detectives responsible for famous cold cases watched closely as investigators combined advanced DNA analysis with painstaking genealogical research to identify suspects who had escaped detection for decades. The April Tinsley investigation immediately stood out as an ideal candidate. The preserved biological evidence remained in excellent condition. The offender's DNA profile was already well established. Traditional investigative methods had been exhausted repeatedly. Most importantly, decades of careful evidence preservation meant the scientific foundation remained exceptionally strong. The Fort Wayne Police Department, working alongside forensic specialists and prosecutors, began evaluating whether genetic genealogy could legally and scientifically be applied to the case. This was not a decision made lightly. Every step required careful consideration. The technology remained relatively new. Legal questions continued evolving. Investigators understood that any identification produced through genealogy would still require independent confirmation using traditional forensic methods before an arrest could occur. Genealogy could generate investigative leads. It could not replace evidence. Once approval was obtained, forensic scientists prepared DNA recovered from the original evidence for specialized analysis. Unlike conventional forensic profiling designed primarily for law enforcement databases, genealogical research required a different type of genetic information. Laboratories extracted thousands of genetic markers capable of revealing distant biological relationships. The process demanded extraordinary precision. Contamination controls became even more rigorous. Quality assurance procedures were repeated. Independent verification confirmed that the genetic profile truly originated from the unknown offender connected to April's murder. Only then did the genealogical phase begin. Investigators uploaded the appropriate DNA data into genealogy platforms that permitted law enforcement use under their applicable policies at the time. They waited. The search did not produce the killer's name. No one expected it to. Instead, the system identified individuals who appeared to share portions of DNA with the unknown suspect. Not siblings. Not parents. Not children. Much more distant relatives. Second cousins. Third cousins. Perhaps even more distant connections. For ordinary genealogy enthusiasts, these results simply represented extended family members previously unknown. For homicide investigators, they represented the beginning of an entirely new investigation. Professional genealogists joined the effort. Their work differed dramatically from conventional detective investigations. Instead of interviewing witnesses or examining crime scenes, they reconstructed enormous family histories, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, military service documents, obituaries, property records, census reports, newspaper archives, church registries, immigration documents. Every historical record became another piece of an expanding family tree. The process resembled assembling a puzzle containing thousands of pieces without knowing what the completed picture should resemble. Family branches extended backward through multiple generations before gradually moving forward again toward the present. Some branches grew rapidly. Others ended unexpectedly. Name changes complicated research. Adoptions required careful documentation. Multiple marriages created additional complexity. Investigators and genealogists worked together continuously, comparing historical research with known facts surrounding April's murder. Geography mattered. Age mattered. Sex mattered. Opportunity mattered. Family trees alone could not identify a killer. Traditional investigative reasoning remained essential. Gradually, the enormous web of possibilities began narrowing. Certain family lines could be eliminated because descendants lived nowhere near Indiana. Others disappeared because individuals were too young or too old in 1988. Some branches contained only women when investigators knew they sought a male offender. Little by little, thousands of possibilities became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became only a handful. This stage required extraordinary patience. Every conclusion demanded verification. Genealogical assumptions could never substitute for documented facts. Detectives confirmed residences, employment histories, educational records, military service, and travel patterns. Historical addresses became especially important. who lived within reasonable distance of Fort Wayne in 1988, who possessed the age and opportunity consistent with the crime, who fit the biological profile suggested by genealogical reconstruction. As investigators narrowed the field, one individual gradually attracted increasing attention. His name was John D. Miller. Born in 1957, Miller had lived in northeastern Indiana during the relevant period. His age fit the offender profile. His geographic history aligned with the investigation. Nothing immediately distinguished him publicly from countless other residents. To neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, he appeared to lead an ordinary life. He had worked steadily. He blended into the community. There had been no decades of public suspicion surrounding his name. No dramatic history placing him permanently on investigators' radar. For nearly 30 years, he had remained invisible. Yet experienced detectives understood an essential principle. Genealogy had not identified the killer. It had identified someone worthy of investigation. The distinction mattered enormously. Every investigative safeguard remained in place. No arrest warrant would be requested based solely upon genealogical analysis. Independent forensic confirmation remained absolutely necessary. Detectives quietly shifted into surveillance mode. The operation unfolded with remarkable secrecy. Very few people knew investigators had identified a possible suspect. Public disclosure risked compromising the investigation. If Miller learned he had become the focus of renewed attention, he might destroy evidence, flee, or alter his behavior. Investigators observed discreetly. His daily routines. His vehicle. His movements. Nothing dramatic occurred. He appeared to live an ordinary existence. Perhaps that normality itself disturbed detectives most. After nearly 30 years, the man potentially responsible for one of Indiana's most horrifying child murders appeared to have blended completely into everyday society. The next objective centered upon obtaining a DNA sample suitable for direct forensic comparison. Law enforcement understood precisely what they needed. They required biological material unquestionably originating from Miller without alerting him to the investigation. Fortunately, established investigative techniques provided lawful methods under appropriate legal circumstances. Detectives conducted surveillance while waiting for an opportunity. Every discarded item potentially containing biological material became important. A used drinking container, a tissue, a utensil, an item carrying saliva suitable for laboratory testing. Eventually, investigators recovered discarded items believed to contain Miller's DNA. The evidence immediately entered laboratory examination. Scientists approached the comparison with extraordinary care. This moment represented the culmination of decades of investigation. One mistake could jeopardize everything. Quality assurance procedures were repeated. Independent analysts verified results. Controls confirmed laboratory integrity. Then came the comparison investigators had awaited for nearly 30 years. The DNA recovered from the discarded items matched the offender profile developed from biological evidence collected during the April Tinsley investigation. The significance was enormous. For the first time since 1988, detectives possessed independent forensic evidence directly connecting a living individual to the crime. Years of uncertainty suddenly crystallized into a single identifiable suspect. Yet investigators remained methodical. Rather than rushing immediately toward arrest, they continued strengthening the evidentiary foundation. Additional surveillance followed. Prosecutors reviewed the developing case. Search warrant preparations began. Every procedural requirement received meticulous attention. Cold case prosecutions succeed not through speed, but through precision. Defense attorneys inevitably scrutinize investigations spanning decades. Detectives anticipated every challenge before it could arise. Meanwhile, Miller continued his ordinary routine, apparently unaware that forensic science had quietly dismantled the anonymity protecting him for nearly 3 decades. The biological evidence preserved so carefully in 1988 had finally spoken with unmistakable clarity. Not through coincidence. Not through confession. Not through luck. But through a scientific revolution unimaginable when April disappeared. For investigators who had devoted years and for some, entire careers to the case, the emotional weight proved difficult to describe. Retired detectives received unexpected telephone calls. Laboratory personnel who had handled evidence decades earlier learned that their painstaking preservation efforts had helped make the breakthrough possible. Families of investigators who had spent countless late nights reviewing reports finally understood why those old boxes had never been forgotten. The case that generations of detectives had inherited was no longer simply a cold case. It had become one of the most significant demonstrations of genetic genealogy in modern American criminal investigation. Yet one crucial step remained. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward John D. Miller. Now investigators needed to confront the man himself and determine whether nearly 30 years of silence would finally end inside an interview room where science, persistence, and history were about to collide in one of the most anticipated moments of the entire investigation. For nearly 30 years, the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley had been defined by unanswered questions. Detectives came and went. Forensic technology evolved beyond anything imagined in 1988. The evidence endured. Now, for the first time, investigators believed they knew exactly who they were looking for. The case had reached its most critical stage not because justice had already been achieved, but because every decision from this point forward had to withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. One procedural mistake could jeopardize decades of work. Every step had to be deliberate. Every piece of evidence had to be independently verified. The science had pointed investigators toward John D. Miller. Now traditional police work had to confirm what the DNA suggested. Investigators assembled a detailed operational plan. Detectives from the Fort Wayne Police Department worked alongside prosecutors, forensic specialists, and other law enforcement personnel to determine the safest and most legally sound approach. They reviewed surveillance reports, laboratory findings, genealogical research, and the original case file that had grown to thousands of pages over nearly 3 decades. Nothing was left to chance. The comparison between the crime scene DNA and the biological material recovered during surveillance had produced a powerful result, but prosecutors wanted more than probability. They wanted certainty, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Search warrants were prepared carefully, outlining the scientific findings and explaining how investigators had arrived at Miller without relying solely on genealogy. The genealogy had generated an investigative lead. The direct DNA comparison had provided the forensic confirmation. By July 2018, investigators were ready to act. On the morning of July 15, 2018, officers executed search warrants connected to the investigation. Law enforcement personnel arrived at Miller's residence in Greville, Indiana, a small community northeast of Fort Wayne. The operation proceeded without public spectacle. Detectives understood they were confronting a man suspected of committing an extraordinarily violent crime decades earlier, but they also knew that preserving evidence and ensuring everyone's safety remained the highest priorities. Investigators searched the residence methodically. Every room received careful attention. Documents were cataloged. Electronic devices were secured according to established forensic procedures. Potential evidence was collected and documented. Nothing about the search resembled the dramatic scenes often portrayed in television crime dramas. Real investigations unfold through patience, documentation, and precision. Every item collected required proper chain of custody procedures. Every photograph had to be accurately logged. Every observation might later become relevant during court proceedings. Miller was taken into custody. For detectives who had spent years studying the case, the moment carried enormous emotional significance. Some had inherited the investigation from retired colleagues who had never lived to see an arrest. Others had devoted countless hours reviewing evidence that had seemed permanently trapped in history. Now they sat across from the man whom science had identified as the likely source of the DNA preserved since 1988. The interview that followed became one of the defining moments of the entire investigation. Experienced homicide investigators approached the conversation carefully. They understood that successful interviews rarely begin with immediate accusations. Instead, detectives often establish timelines, discuss ordinary aspects of a suspect's life, and gradually introduce increasingly specific questions. This method allows investigators to evaluate reactions, compare statements against known evidence, and identify inconsistencies. Initially, Miller answered questions. Detectives explored his background. Where had he lived during the late 1980s? What had his daily routines been? Did he remember April Tinsley? Did he recognize the neighborhood where she disappeared? The conversation slowly narrowed toward the evidence. Then investigators revealed what decades of scientific progress had accomplished. They explained that biological evidence collected in 1988 had been preserved. They explained that forensic DNA technology had advanced dramatically. They explained that the investigation had identified him. For many suspects, this is the moment denial intensifies. Some challenge the science. Others attempt alternative explanations. Some request attorneys immediately. Investigators were prepared for every possibility. According to later court records, Miller ultimately made statements acknowledging responsibility for the crimes committed against April Tinsley. Those admissions did not replace the forensic evidence. Instead, they strengthened an already powerful case built upon decades of careful investigation and preserved biological evidence. The confession represented the end of one mystery and the beginning of another. How had a man remained unidentified for nearly 30 years despite leaving biological evidence? The answer lay not in investigative failure, but in the limitations of available technology. In 1988, detectives had preserved evidence they could not yet fully exploit. They had trusted future science. That trust had finally been rewarded. News of the arrest spread rapidly across Indiana and soon attracted national attention. Headlines emphasized the extraordinary role of forensic genealogy. Television networks described the case as a landmark example of modern investigative science. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States studied the investigation carefully, recognizing its broader implications for thousands of unsolved murders sitting inside evidence rooms across the country. For April's family, however, the story remained deeply personal. Nearly 30 years had passed since they lost an 8-year-old daughter. Birthdays had come and gone. Holidays had passed with an empty place at family gatherings. Generations had grown older while the investigation remained unresolved. Now, at last, the person accused of ending April's life had been identified. No arrest could erase decades of grief. No conviction could restore the childhood that had been stolen. But after 30 years of uncertainty, the family finally possessed something that had remained absent since April disappeared. An answer. Investigators also reflected upon the countless individuals whose work had contributed to the breakthrough. The patrol officers who searched neighborhoods during the first desperate hours. The crime scene technicians who collected evidence with painstaking care. The forensic scientists who preserved biological samples through decades of technological change. The detectives who refused to close the file despite repeated disappointments. The genealogists who reconstructed complex family histories. The laboratory analysts who confirmed the DNA comparisons. Justice, when it finally arrived, belonged not to one investigator, but to generations of professionals whose work overlapped across 3 decades. Public reaction revealed another remarkable truth. Many younger residents of Indiana had never heard of April Tinsley's case until the arrest. For older generations, however, the name immediately reopened memories that had never fully disappeared. Parents remembered warning their children after the murder. Teachers remembered classroom discussions about personal safety. Police officers remembered working endless shifts during the original investigation. Communities remembered fear. Now they remembered persistence. The case also transformed national conversations surrounding forensic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies recognized that thousands of cold cases containing preserved DNA might now possess realistic investigative pathways. Prosecutors evaluated long unsolved homicides previously considered impossible to solve. Evidence rooms across America suddenly contained renewed hope. Cases once viewed as permanently dormant returned to active investigation. Scientists emphasized that genealogy alone never determines guilt. Traditional investigative work remained essential. Independent DNA confirmation remained essential. Judicial oversight remained essential. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated not only the extraordinary potential of genetic genealogy, but also the importance of integrating emerging technology with established investigative standards. As preparations began for criminal proceedings, prosecutors organized evidence spanning nearly 3 decades. Original crime scene documentation, autopsy findings, forensic laboratory reports, DNA analyses, genealogical research, search warrant materials, interview records. Every exhibit required careful presentation. Time complicated the prosecution. Witnesses had aged. Some investigators had retired. Others had passed away. Records created using technologies from the late 1980s required careful explanation for modern jurors unfamiliar with investigative practices from that era. The prosecution's challenge extended beyond proving guilt. It also required demonstrating the integrity of evidence preserved through 30 years of scientific evolution. Meanwhile, detectives quietly reflected upon another lesson hidden within the investigation. Cold cases rarely solve themselves. Science may create new opportunities, but those opportunities exist only because someone decades earlier chose not to discard evidence, chose to document procedures carefully, and chose to believe that unanswered questions deserved continued attention. The evidence collected in 1988 had survived because investigators understood an essential principle of homicide investigation. Technology changes. Truth does not. The biological evidence had always contained the killer's identity. Science simply needed enough time to learn how to read it. For the first time since the spring of 1988, the April Tinsley investigation was no longer searching for an unknown offender. Instead, it entered the courtroom phase, where decades of meticulous detective work, revolutionary forensic science, and a family's unwavering hope would be tested before the justice system in one final effort to secure accountability for a crime that had haunted Indiana for an entire generation. The arrest of John D. Miller marked a historic turning point, but for prosecutors and investigators, the case was far from over. A successful arrest is not the same as a successful prosecution. Every piece of evidence collected over 3 decades would now face intense legal scrutiny. Defense attorneys would examine every laboratory procedure, every chain of custody document, every interview, and every scientific method that led investigators from an unidentified DNA profile to a named suspect. The burden remained exactly where it had always been on the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt using reliable, admissible evidence. Inside the Allen County Prosecutor's Office, attorneys began organizing one of the most unusual homicide cases the office had ever handled. The file represented nearly 30 years of investigative work. Some reports had been typed on typewriters. Others existed only as handwritten notes prepared by detectives in 1988. More recent documents were entirely digital. Different generations of investigators had used different recording systems, evidence numbering conventions, and forensic reporting standards. Prosecutors had to transform decades of accumulated material into one coherent narrative that a jury could understand. The original crime scene documentation became critically important once again. Photographs taken in April 1988 were reviewed repeatedly. Crime scene sketches were enlarged and digitized. Evidence logs were compared against laboratory submission records. Every transfer of biological evidence from the original collection through multiple rounds of scientific testing over nearly 3 decades had to be documented precisely. Chain of custody is one of the foundations of criminal prosecution. If prosecutors cannot demonstrate that evidence remains secure and untampered with throughout its existence, jurors may question its reliability. Fortunately for investigators, the April Tinsley evidence had been handled with exceptional care. The biological evidence recovered during the original investigation had remained preserved under controlled conditions. Every significant movement of that evidence had been documented. Laboratory personnel who examined it over the years followed established forensic protocols. Independent reviews confirmed that the DNA profile remained consistent across successive generations of testing. That consistency became one of the prosecution's greatest strengths. Unlike eyewitness testimony, which can fade over time, DNA evidence does not change because decades pass. The genetic profile obtained from the crime scene in 1988 remained exactly the same profile identified through modern forensic testing in 2018. Science had not rewritten history. It had simply become capable of understanding evidence that investigators had preserved decades earlier. The role of investigative genetic genealogy also required careful explanation. Prosecutors understood that jurors might find the technique unfamiliar. Rather than presenting genealogy as proof of guilt, investigators described it accurately as an investigative tool that generated a lead. Once genealogical research suggested John D. Miller as a possible suspect, detectives pursued traditional investigative methods. Surveillance. Recovery of discarded biological material. Independent forensic DNA comparison. Only after those conventional investigative steps confirmed the genetic match did the case move toward arrest. This distinction mattered greatly. The prosecution's evidence rested upon the direct DNA comparison between Miller and the biological evidence recovered from April Tinsley's murder, not upon genealogy itself. Meanwhile, Forensic scientists prepared to explain complex laboratory procedures in language understandable to ordinary jurors. They anticipated questions. How reliable is DNA? Could contamination explain the match? How were laboratory errors prevented? Why had the evidence remained useful after 30 years? Each answer relied upon decades of scientific advancement and rigorous quality control standards. Modern forensic laboratories operate under extensive accreditation requirements. Evidence undergoes multiple levels of review. Independent analysts verify conclusions. Controls detect contamination. Documentation accompanies every stage of testing. The April Tinsley investigation benefited not only from technological advancement, but also from the discipline of forensic professionals who understood that every scientific conclusion might someday be challenged in court. Outside the legal process, the public continued absorbing the extraordinary news. Communities throughout Indiana revisited memories from 1988. Many residents remembered seeing April's photograph on missing person posters. Others remembered participating in volunteer searches. Retired police officers gave interviews describing the frustration of working a case that had resisted solution for nearly 3 decades. Teachers recalled classroom discussions about personal safety that followed the murder. Parents remembered the fear that had spread through neighborhoods almost overnight. For many, the arrest felt less like current news and more like the closing chapter of a story that had remained unfinished for most of their adult lives. The investigation also attracted widespread attention from law enforcement agencies across the United States. The detectives responsible for their own unsolved murders studied the case closely. Evidence preservation practices received renewed emphasis. Cold case units expanded. Agencies reviewed older investigations containing unidentified DNA profiles that had produced no CODIS matches. The success of the April Tinsley investigation reinforced a growing belief. Some of yesterday's impossible cases might simply be waiting for tomorrow's science. The broader implications extended well beyond Indiana. Forensic genealogy quickly emerged as one of the most significant investigative developments of the 21st century. However, experts repeatedly emphasized responsible use. Every genealogical lead required independent verification. Privacy considerations demanded careful legal oversight. Scientific accuracy remained essential. The April Tinsley investigation became one of several landmark cases demonstrating that revolutionary technology achieves its greatest value only when combined with meticulous traditional detective work. During the legal proceedings, John D. Miller ultimately chose not to contest the overwhelming forensic evidence through a jury trial. According to court records, he entered a guilty plea to charges connected with April Tinsley's murder. The plea acknowledged responsibility and eliminated the need for the victim's family to endure a lengthy public trial involving extensive testimony about the crime. For prosecutors, the guilty plea represented confirmation that decades of investigative work had reached its intended conclusion. For April's family, emotions remained far more complex. No legal proceeding could restore the years stolen from them. Nearly 30 years had passed since April left home expecting an ordinary day. Entire chapters of family life had unfolded without her. Parents had grown older. Relatives had spent decades living with uncertainty. Questions that had once seemed impossible to answer had finally received answers, but those answers arrived only after a lifetime of waiting. Victim impact proceedings reminded the courtroom that homicide investigations involve far more than evidence and legal procedure. Every murder leaves behind families forced to continue living long after headlines disappear. Cold cases often magnify that burden. Instead of grieving with uncertainty, families endure years of unanswered questions. Every anniversary reopens wounds. Every news report renews hope. Every unsuccessful lead brings renewed disappointment. When justice finally arrives decades later, it provides accountability, but it cannot return the time that has already been lost. The court ultimately sentenced John D. Miller to 80 years in prison. The sentence reflected the extraordinary seriousness of the crimes committed against April Tinsley. For investigators who had carried the case across generations, the moment represented something rarely experienced in policing. Completion. Many homicide detectives retire without seeing resolution in their most difficult investigations. Some pass away before arrests occur. The April Tinsley investigation belonged not to one detective, but to several generations of investigators whose combined efforts finally achieved what none could accomplish alone. Retired detectives attended proceedings. Former investigators spoke publicly about the emotional significance of seeing justice delivered after 30 years. Some described the outcome as the fulfillment of a promise made silently to April's family decades earlier. Others reflected on the importance of never abandoning difficult investigations simply because time passes. Throughout the investigation, one lesson remained remarkably consistent. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Patience matters. The detectives working in 1988 could not possibly predict genetic genealogy. The scientists preserving biological samples could not foresee the technological revolution awaiting forensic laboratories. Yet they understood one enduring principle: protect the evidence. Document everything. Someday, someone may possess better tools. That philosophy ultimately transformed an unsolved murder into one of the most influential cold case resolutions in American criminal justice. As the legal proceedings concluded, the April Tinsley investigation ceased being an active homicide case and became something else entirely: a landmark example, studied by investigators, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and criminal justice students across the country. It demonstrated that persistence, scientific integrity, and careful evidence preservation could overcome even the longest passage of time, ensuring that a child whose life ended in 1988 would not be forgotten, and that the pursuit of justice could continue across generations until the truth was finally established. When the courtroom proceedings concluded and John D. Miller began serving his sentence, many outside the criminal justice system assumed the April Tinsley investigation had finally reached its end. For the detectives who had lived with the case, however, the closing of the prosecution marked something very different. It was the moment they finally had time to look back not only at what had happened in 1988, but at everything that had followed over the next 30 years. The investigation had become far more than the resolution of a single homicide. It had evolved into a case study in patience, evidence preservation, scientific innovation, and the determination of generations of investigators who refused to let time defeat justice. Within weeks of the sentencing, police departments throughout the United States began requesting information about the investigative methods used in Fort Wayne. Cold case detectives wanted to understand every stage of the process. They asked how biological evidence had been preserved for so long. They wanted to know how the genealogical investigation had been initiated, how traditional detective work had verified the scientific findings, and how prosecutors had successfully presented such an unusual case inside a courtroom. The April Tinsley investigation quickly became one of the most closely examined homicide cases in modern American law enforcement. Training conferences devoted entire sessions to the investigation. Forensic scientists explained how advances in DNA sequencing had made it possible to develop profiles unimaginable during the late 1980s. Genealogists described the painstaking reconstruction of extended family trees stretching back generations. Detectives emphasized that technology alone had never solved the case. The science had pointed toward a family. Police work had identified the suspect. Forensic testing had confirmed the biological evidence. Prosecutors had assembled the legal case. Each discipline depended upon the others. No single breakthrough would have been sufficient on its own. One of the most important lessons centered on evidence preservation. In 1988, investigators could not foresee the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy. The technology simply did not exist, yet they made decisions that proved invaluable decades later. Biological evidence was collected carefully, documented thoroughly, and stored according to accepted forensic standards. Rather than consuming every available sample during early testing, laboratories preserved material whenever possible for future examination. Those choices reflected professional discipline rather than extraordinary prediction. Detectives simply understood that scientific methods evolve. Evidence lost today cannot be recovered tomorrow. The case also illustrated another reality often overlooked by the public. Cold case investigations rarely involve one dramatic breakthrough followed immediately by an arrest. Instead, they progress through hundreds of incremental advances. A laboratory improvement, a database expansion, a newly available forensic technique, a fresh review by investigators who ask different questions. Each development appears small when viewed individually. Together, they create the opportunity for resolution. Throughout the years following the conviction, law enforcement agencies increasingly established specialized cold case units, rather than assigning decades-old investigations only when active workloads permitted. Departments began creating dedicated teams focused entirely upon unsolved murders. Detectives working these units combined traditional investigative experience with an understanding of modern forensic science. They recognized that evidence overlooked 20 or 30 years earlier might acquire entirely new significance under contemporary laboratory methods. April Tinsley's case frequently appeared during those discussions, not because investigators had been lucky, but because they had been persistent. Persistence, experienced detectives often explained, differs fundamentally from repetition. Repeating unsuccessful investigative methods indefinitely rarely produces new results. Persistence means continually reevaluating evidence as technology, science, and investigative techniques evolve. The April Tinsley investigation embodied that philosophy. The same evidence remained. The science changed. The answers followed. For forensic genealogists, the case demonstrated the extraordinary potential of combining historical research with biological science. Constructing extended family trees required far more than simply examining DNA matches. Researchers analyzed birth certificates, census records, marriage licenses, military service documents, probate files, obituaries, newspaper archives, and countless other historical sources. Every relationship required documentation. Every assumption demanded verification. The work resembled historical scholarship as much as criminal investigation. This careful methodology proved essential. Mistakes within genealogy could misdirect investigators toward entirely innocent families. Accuracy mattered at every stage. The April Tinsley investigation showed that genealogical research must remain disciplined, transparent, and subject to independent confirmation. Meanwhile, universities incorporated the case into forensic science and criminal justice curricula. Students examined the investigation chronologically. The initial response: crime scene processing, evidence preservation, traditional investigative methods, DNA profiling, CODIS comparisons, investigative genetic genealogy, legal proceedings. The case offered an unusually complete example of how criminal investigations evolve across multiple generations of scientific progress. The broader public also became increasingly aware of forensic genealogy. Documentaries explored the investigation. True crime authors analyzed its significance. News organizations revisited the extraordinary path from an unsolved child murder in 1988 to a Dana-supported identification 3 decades later. Yet responsible reporting consistently emphasized an important distinction. Genetic genealogy did not replace conventional evidence. It generated investigative leads requiring independent verification. This distinction protected both scientific credibility and legal fairness. Within the Fort Wayne Police Department, investigators quietly reflected upon another aspect of the case rarely discussed publicly. Many detectives who contributed significantly to the investigation never received widespread recognition. Crime scene technicians who preserved evidence. Evidence custodians who maintained secure storage. Laboratory personnel who repeated testing over many years. Administrative staff who organized thousands of documents. Retired investigators who mentored younger detectives inheriting the case. Successful homicide investigations often depend upon professionals working far from television cameras and newspaper headlines. Their contributions remain largely invisible, despite being absolutely essential. April's family continued honoring her memory long after the legal proceedings concluded. For them, justice represented accountability rather than closure. Experienced victim advocates often explain that closure can be an unrealistic expectation following homicide. Nothing restores the years taken away. Nothing replaces birthdays never celebrated, family gatherings forever altered, or childhood memories that never had the opportunity to exist. What justice can provide is certainty. The uncertainty that had haunted April's family for nearly 30 years finally ended. Questions about who committed the crime no longer remained unanswered. That certainty carried profound emotional significance even though grief itself continued. Community members likewise reflected upon how deeply the murder had influenced local history. Parents who had changed household rules after April disappeared now found themselves discussing the case with grandchildren. Teachers remembered school safety programs introduced in response to the investigation. Police officers recalled how the case shaped their understanding of crimes against children. The murder had permanently altered Fort Wayne's collective memory. The eventual resolution became equally significant. It reminded communities that justice sometimes requires extraordinary patience. Perhaps the investigation's greatest legacy lies not in its scientific innovation alone, but in what it demonstrated about institutional commitment. Governments change. Police chiefs retire. Detectives transfer. Prosecutors leave office. Technology advances. Yet the responsibility to pursue justice continues across generations. The April Tinsley investigation survived those transitions because each generation accepted responsibility for carrying the case forward rather than allowing it to disappear into forgotten archives. That continuity proved every bit as important as the DNA itself. Without investigators willing to revisit the evidence repeatedly, no scientific breakthrough would have mattered. Without laboratory personnel preserving biological samples carefully, no genealogy would have been possible. Without prosecutors prepared to understand emerging forensic science, no conviction would have followed. The case represented the convergence of persistence and innovation. As forensic science continues advancing, investigators often return to the April Tinsley case for one enduring lesson. Evidence collected today may answer questions impossible to imagine tomorrow. The responsibility of today's investigators extends beyond current technology. It includes preserving opportunities for future generations. That philosophy now guides evidence handling practices in countless homicide investigations. Long after the headlines faded, April Tinsley's name continued appearing in classrooms, forensic conferences, police academies, and scientific journals, not simply as the victim of a tragic crime, but as the child whose case helped demonstrate that time is not always the greatest enemy of justice. Sometimes, if evidence is preserved, investigations remain active, and science continues to advance, time itself becomes the very force that eventually reveals the truth hidden for decades. The resolution of the April Tinsley case did not simply close one investigation. It accelerated a transformation already underway within modern criminal justice. Across the United States, police departments began looking differently at shelves filled with aging evidence boxes. Files that had long been labeled inactive, unsolved, or cold suddenly represented possibility rather than defeat. Detectives who had spent years believing certain cases would never be solved found themselves asking a new question. If April Tinsley's killer could be identified after nearly 30 years, how many other offenders had unknowingly left behind the evidence that would eventually expose them? Inside forensic laboratories, that question became increasingly urgent. Evidence technicians reviewed preservation procedures developed decades earlier. Biological samples collected during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s were re-examined to determine whether they remained suitable for modern DNA analysis. In many cases, investigators discovered that careful storage had protected evidence far better than anyone originally expected. Samples once considered too limited for meaningful examination could now yield complete or partial genetic profiles using technologies unavailable when the crimes occurred. The April Tinsley investigation became one of the strongest examples demonstrating why evidence should never be discarded simply because existing science appears unable to answer every question. For cold case detectives, the lesson was immediate. A lack of answers today does not mean answers will never exist. It simply means science has not yet reached them. This philosophy reshaped investigative priorities nationwide. Departments that once concentrated almost exclusively on current cases began dedicating additional personnel to historical investigations. Specialized cold case units expanded. Prosecutors partnered more closely with forensic scientists. State crime laboratories developed strategies for reevaluating biological evidence preserved for decades. Funding increasingly supported the review of older homicide files rather than focusing solely upon newly committed crimes. The shift reflected more than optimism. It reflected evidence. The April Tinsley investigation had proven that patience combined with scientific advancement could succeed where traditional methods alone had failed. Investigators also recognized another important reality. Cold case investigations require institutional memory. Every detective eventually retires. Every generation of investigators eventually passes responsibility to another. Without comprehensive documentation, critical knowledge disappears. The April Tinsley file survived because each generation carefully recorded not only investigative conclusions, but also investigative reasoning. Future detectives understood why earlier decisions had been made. They knew which leads had been exhausted and which remained uncertain. That documentation prevented the investigation from repeating the same unsuccessful paths endlessly. Instead, each generation built upon the work completed before them. Police academies began incorporating this principle into homicide investigation training. Young detectives learned that writing detailed reports served not only present investigations, but also investigators who might inherit those cases decades later. The importance of documentation extended far beyond administrative necessity. It preserved institutional knowledge. The April Tinsley investigation also highlighted the extraordinary value of interdisciplinary cooperation. Historically, homicide investigations often relied primarily upon detectives, forensic scientists, and prosecutors. Modern cold case investigations expanded that model dramatically. Genealogists, crime analysts, digital mapping specialists, behavioral scientists, laboratory geneticists. Each discipline contributed expertise unavailable to previous generations. The case demonstrated that solving complex investigations increasingly required collaboration extending well beyond traditional policing. The legal community also studied the prosecution carefully. Cortez had to evaluate evidence produced through investigative methods that did not exist when the crime occurred. Judges examined questions surrounding forensic genealogy. Prosecutors developed strategies explaining emerging science clearly to Cortez while ensuring that constitutional protections remained fully respected. The April Tinsley investigation helped establish practical examples for handling these issues responsibly. Legal scholars emphasized an important distinction. Investigative genealogy generated leads. Evidence generated convictions. This principle protected both scientific credibility and legal fairness. Public interest in the case remained remarkably strong. True crime documentaries explore the investigation. Podcasts examine the forensic breakthrough. Journalists interviewed retired detectives who described the emotional experience of finally identifying the offender after nearly 3 decades. Many investigators admitted that they had never expected to witness the resolution during their own careers. Some had inherited the case from mentors who had long since retired. Others had joined the department years after April's murder occurred. Yet every generation accepted responsibility for continuing the search. The case also inspired renewed attention toward families still waiting for answers in other unsolved investigations. Organizations supporting victims' families frequently cited April's case when encouraging relatives not to lose hope. Responsible advocates remained careful not to promise eventual resolution. Not every cold case contains recoverable biological evidence. Not every investigation benefits from suitable forensic opportunities. Nevertheless, April's case demonstrated that the passage of time alone does not eliminate the possibility of justice. Hope could remain grounded in scientific progress rather than wishful thinking. Meanwhile, forensic genealogy itself continued evolving rapidly. Researchers refined laboratory methods. Genealogists developed increasingly sophisticated approaches for reconstructing family relationships. Public understanding of DNA technology expanded. Professional organizations established standards governing investigative practices, documentation, and quality assurance. The field matured quickly, influenced partly by successful investigations such as April Tinsley's. Scientists repeatedly reminded investigators that genetics alone never tells the entire story. DNA can identify biological relationships. It cannot explain motive. It cannot reconstruct every event. It cannot replace careful detective work. The April Tinsley investigation succeeded because scientific evidence and traditional investigation complemented one another throughout the process. Retired investigators often reflected upon the remarkable contrast between 1988 and 2018. During the original investigation, detectives relied heavily upon neighborhood canvases, handwritten notes, physical maps, telephone records, and face-to-face interviews. Computers played only limited roles. DNA profiling remained experimental. The internet did not exist as a practical investigative resource. 3 decades later, the investigation concluded through technologies unimaginable during those first frantic days following April's disappearance. Yet despite revolutionary scientific progress, one element remained unchanged: the determination of investigators. Technology provided tools. People applied them. Every scientific advancement still required detectives willing to reopen old files, laboratory personnel willing to repeat complex analyses, prosecutors willing to understand unfamiliar evidence, and leadership willing to allocate resources toward cases many considered unsolvable. Without that human commitment, even extraordinary technology accomplishes little. Perhaps no aspect of the investigation better illustrates this principle than the preservation of evidence itself. Someone in 1988 chose to preserve biological samples carefully. Someone documented every transfer. Someone maintained storage conditions year after year. Someone resisted discarding evidence despite decades without arrest. Those routine professional decisions eventually became the foundation upon which modern science built its breakthrough. The case, therefore, represents not merely a triumph of technology, but also a triumph of professional discipline. Every investigator who touched the file contributed something essential. The patrol officers who responded immediately. The crime scene technicians who documented every detail. The laboratory scientists who safeguarded evidence. The detectives who pursued thousands of leads. The genealogists who reconstructed family histories. The prosecutors who organized decades of investigative work. Justice emerged from cumulative effort rather than singular brilliance. As criminal justice agencies continue reviewing unsolved homicides, the April Tinsley investigation remains a powerful reminder that every carefully preserved piece of evidence carries potential value extending far beyond current technology. Somewhere inside countless evidence rooms, biological samples collected decades ago still wait silently for future scientific advances. Some may never produce answers. Others may one day identify offenders who believe time had erased their crimes forever. The April Tinsley case proved that evidence does not forget, and that the truth, preserved patiently through generations of investigators, can remain hidden for decades before finally emerging with extraordinary clarity when science becomes capable of revealing what was always there. As the April Tinsley investigation entered the history books, its influence spread far beyond Indiana. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice researchers increasingly viewed the case not simply as the successful resolution of a single homicide, but as a landmark example of how decades of persistence, evidence preservation, and scientific innovation could converge to solve crimes once believed impossible. The investigation demonstrated that while technology evolves rapidly, its greatest value depends upon the professionalism of those responsible for collecting, preserving, interpreting, and presenting evidence. One of the first changes observed nationwide involved the reassessment of cold case inventories. Police departments had long maintained lists of unsolved homicides, many dating back several decades. Traditionally, these files were prioritized according to witness availability, physical evidence, and investigative potential. After the success of forensic genealogy in the April Tinsley investigation and other contemporary cases, agencies began reviewing those files with entirely new criteria. Did biological evidence still exist? Had the evidence been properly preserved? Could modern DNA technology recover information unavailable during the original investigation? Could the case benefit from advanced forensic genealogy? These questions became central to modern cold case strategy. Across the country, evidence rooms were reopened. Boxes that had remained untouched for years were carefully removed from storage. Laboratory technicians examined clothing, personal belongings, envelopes, cigarette butts, drinking containers, and other items collected decades earlier. Some samples had deteriorated beyond recovery. Others remained remarkably well preserved. Every successful DNA profile represented another opportunity. Another family waiting for answers. Another investigation receiving new life. The April Tinsley investigation also reinforced the importance of long-term evidence management. Evidence preservation is often invisible to the public. Crime scene investigators carefully package biological material. Laboratory personnel monitor storage conditions. Evidence custodians maintain meticulous documentation. These responsibilities rarely attract headlines, yet the entire success of future forensic analysis depends upon them. Had biological evidence from April's case been contaminated, misplaced, or discarded during the intervening decades, no scientific breakthrough would have been possible. The case became a powerful reminder that evidence collected today may answer questions investigators cannot yet imagine. Forensic education evolved as well. Universities expanded coursework covering DNA technology, cold case investigations, and investigative genetic genealogy. Students examined the April Tinsley investigation chronologically, analyzing how each stage reflected the capabilities and limitations of its era. The initial crime scene response, traditional witness interviews, behavioral analysis, early forensic testing, CODIS comparisons, genetic genealogy, courtroom presentation. Rather than portraying the case as a single breakthrough, educators emphasized the cumulative nature of successful investigations. No individual decision solved the case. Each generation contributed something essential. The investigation also highlighted the growing relationship between public genealogy databases and criminal justice. Millions of people had submitted DNA voluntarily for family history research. Most sought information about ancestry rather than criminal investigations. As genealogy became increasingly relevant to law enforcement, public discussion expanded regarding privacy, consent, transparency, and responsible investigative practices. The April Tinsley investigation often appeared within those conversations because it demonstrated both the remarkable investigative potential and the importance of careful legal oversight. Professional organizations developed guidelines encouraging investigators to use genealogy responsibly. The objective remained clear: identify suspects through lawful investigative methods. Verify every genealogical lead independently. Protect constitutional rights. Ensure scientific accuracy. Avoid drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. These principles reflected lessons learned through pioneering investigations, including April's. Within the Fort Wayne Police Department, detectives occasionally reflected upon how differently the investigation might have unfolded under modern conditions. Had surveillance cameras existed throughout the neighborhood in 1988, investigators might have reconstructed April's final movements more precisely. Cell phone records could have established timelines. Automatic license plate readers might have identified suspicious vehicles. Digital financial records could have documented suspect movements. Social media might have generated witnesses unavailable through traditional canvassing. Yet experienced investigators remained cautious about such speculation. Every era presents different investigative challenges. Modern investigations benefit from technology, but also confront enormous quantities of digital information requiring careful analysis. The essential principles remain unchanged. Preserve evidence. Verify facts. Document findings. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Throughout the years following the conviction, retired investigators frequently participated in professional conferences discussing cold case methodology. Many emphasized that perseverance mattered as much as scientific innovation. Investigative momentum often declines naturally as years pass. Personnel changes occur. Budgets shift. Public attention fades. Maintaining institutional commitment across decades requires leadership willing to recognize that justice remains important even when immediate results seem unlikely. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated the value of that commitment. Generations of detectives inherited the case rather than abandoning it. Each contributed knowledge. Each respected earlier work. Each remained prepared for future scientific opportunities. Another lasting contribution involved interdisciplinary cooperation. The investigation brought together professionals whose careers rarely intersected before the emergence of forensic genealogy. Police detectives, forensic biologists, genealogical researchers, crime analysts, laboratory geneticists, prosecutors, digital mapping specialists, evidence custodians. Every discipline addressed different aspects of the same problem. Together, they achieved what none could accomplish independently. This collaborative model increasingly influenced major investigations across the United States. Public perception of cold cases changed as well. Historically, many people viewed unsolved murders as investigations permanently trapped by missing evidence or investigative mistakes. The April Tinsley investigation encouraged a more nuanced understanding. Some cold cases remain unsolved because technology has not yet reached the necessary level. Others await new witnesses. Some require fresh investigative perspectives. The absence of immediate resolution does not necessarily indicate investigative failure. Sometimes the evidence simply requires scientific methods that do not yet exist. This realization encouraged agencies to preserve evidence more carefully than ever before. It also provided measured hope to families whose loved ones remained victims of unsolved crimes. Victim advocacy organizations frequently referenced cases like April's while emphasizing realistic expectations. Not every investigation contains recoverable DNA. Not every offender leaves biological evidence. Not every preserved sample remains suitable for modern analysis. Yet scientific progress continues. Families deserved honesty regarding limitations while also understanding that investigations need not end simply because years have passed. For April Tinsley's family, public attention gradually shifted away from courtroom proceedings toward remembrance. Community events honored April's life rather than focusing solely upon the crime. Scholarships, memorial activities, and educational programs emphasized child safety and community awareness. These efforts reflected an important principle embraced by many families affected by violent crime. A victim's identity should never become limited to the circumstances of death. April had been a daughter, a student, a friend, an 8-year-old child with dreams interrupted by unimaginable violence. Justice acknowledged the crime. Remembrance honored the person. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the investigation lies in what it revealed about time itself. For decades, the passage of years seemed to favor the offender. Witnesses forgot details. Leads disappeared. Public attention faded. The case grew older. Then something remarkable occurred. Time changed sides. Scientific research advanced. DNA technology improved. Genealogical databases expanded. Investigative methods evolved. The same years that once protected the killer ultimately created the tools necessary to identify him. The evidence had remained unchanged. Time transformed science instead. That reversal fundamentally altered how investigators viewed long unsolved homicides. Time no longer represented only the enemy of justice. Under the right circumstances, it could become one of its greatest allies. As forensic science continues advancing into new frontiers, including increasingly sensitive DNA recovery techniques, improved analytical software, and enhanced genealogical methodologies, the April Tinsley investigation remains an enduring example of what becomes possible when evidence is preserved, investigators remain persistent, and scientific innovation is matched by careful legal and investigative discipline. It stands as a reminder that justice sometimes arrives not through sudden revelation, but through decades of quiet determination, carried forward by people who believed that even the oldest unanswered questions deserved one more chance to be heard. More than 3 decades after April Tinsley disappeared from her neighborhood in Fort Wayne, investigators across the United States continue to reference her case whenever discussing the future of homicide investigations. What had once been regarded as one of Indiana's most heartbreaking unsolved murders had become an enduring example of how criminal investigations evolve over time. It demonstrated that justice is rarely the product of a single breakthrough. Instead, it emerges through the accumulation of thousands of careful decisions made by investigators, scientists, prosecutors, and evidence custodians who often never meet one another, but whose work becomes connected across generations. The story also challenged one of the oldest assumptions in criminal investigation. For decades, many offenders believed that if they avoided identification during the first critical months after a crime, their chances of escaping justice increased dramatically. Historically, there was truth to that belief. Witness memories faded. Physical evidence deteriorated. Investigators retired. Records became more difficult to interpret. Every passing year reduced the likelihood of solving many crimes. The April Tinsley investigation revealed that this assumption was no longer universally true. In the era of modern forensic science, the passage of time can strengthen an investigation rather than weaken it. DNA technology improves. Laboratory techniques become more sensitive. Analytical software grows more sophisticated. Historical records become increasingly digitized. Genealogical databases expand. Scientific disciplines continue to develop methods unimaginable only a decade earlier. Instead of erasing evidence, time may enhance investigators' ability to understand it. This shift represents one of the most significant developments in modern criminal justice. Investigators now approach unsolved homicides with greater confidence that future scientific advances may reveal information unavailable today. As a result, agencies increasingly emphasize comprehensive evidence preservation. The philosophy is straightforward. Collect thoroughly. Document carefully. Preserve completely. Allow future science every possible opportunity. This approach extends beyond biological evidence. Crime scene photographs receive high-resolution digital preservation. Handwritten investigative notes are scanned and archived. Physical maps become searchable digital records. Evidence inventories undergo routine verification. Every detail preserved today may become significant tomorrow. The April Tinsley investigation illustrated exactly why such diligence matters. One of the most remarkable aspects of the case was how consistently the original evidence withstood decades of scrutiny. Every new generation of forensic testing confirmed earlier conclusions. Rather than contradicting previous work, scientific advancement strengthened it. This consistency reinforced confidence not only in the laboratory results, but also in the professionalism of those responsible for preserving the evidence. Experienced forensic scientists often point to this case when explaining an important principle. Technology changes. Scientific integrity does not. Careful